In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, a charming stranger, Victor Langston, dazzles the locals with a grand charity gala. But when a priceless sapphire brooch vanishes, Miss Jane Marple's suspicions ignite. Beneath his polished smile lies a web of deceit, smuggling, swindling, and secrets. As Langston flees, Miss Marple's sharp mind unravels his lies, leading to a thrilling coastal chase and a dramatic showdown on a stormy island. Will her keen insight outwit the scoundrel before he escapes justice? Dive into a classic mystery where no clue is too small and no villain too clever for Miss Marple. Chapter 1. A stranger in St. Mary. Meet the late summer sun cast a golden glow over St. Mary Mead, a village so quintessentially English that it seemed to exist outside of time. The thatched cottages, with their tidy gardens bursting with roses and hollyhocks, lined the single winding lane that led from the church to the green. At the heart of the village, the tea shop, run by the indefatigable Mrs. Puddicombe, hummed with the gentle buzz of gossip, the clink of teacups, and the occasional rustle of a newspaper. It was here, on a Tuesday afternoon, that Miss Jane Marple sat in her usual corner, her knitting needles clicking softly, her eyes half closed as she listened to the rhythm of village life. Miss Marple, with her fluffy white hair and delicate, almost frail appearance, was a fixture in St. Mary Mead. To the casual observer, she was merely an elderly spinster, fond of her garden, her knitting, and the occasional sherry with friends. But those who knew her well, her nephew, Raymond West, or her dear friend, Dolly Bantry, understood that beneath her gentle exterior lay a mind as sharp as a razor, capable of unraveling the most tangled of human motives. She had a knack for noticing things, the way a glance lingered too long, the slight tremor in a voice, or the odd detail that others overlooked. And today, as she sipped her tea and worked on a pale blue shawl, her attention was drawn to the conversation at the next table. Mrs. Puddicombe, her round face flushed from bustling between the counter and the tables, was holding court with Mrs. Lucy Price, the postmistress, and young Miss Hartnell, who taught at the village school. Their voices carried just enough for Miss Marple to catch the thread of their discussion. "He's ever so charming, isn't he?" Mrs. Price was saying, her eyes bright with excitement. "Mr. Victor Langston, that's his name. Rented Ashfield Manor, up on the hill. They say he's from London, with a fortune made in trade or some such, and so generous. He's planning a charity gala, you know, for an orphanage in the city." Miss Hartnell, whose enthusiasm for newcomers was tempered by her natural skepticism, raised an eyebrow. "A gala at Ashfield Manor? That old place hasn't seen a party in years, not since the Colonel passed. And what do we know about this Langston fellow, anyway? He's not been here a week, and already he's got half the village eating out of his hand." "Oh, don't be so suspicious, Emily," Mrs. Puddicombe chided, wiping her hands on her apron. "He came into the shop yesterday, ordered scones and a pot of Darjeeling, and left a tip so generous I nearly dropped my tray. Said he wanted to make a good impression on us all. And his smile, why, it's enough to make you forget your own name." Miss Marple's needles paused for a moment, her lips curving into a faint smile. She had heard such talk before, about charming strangers who arrived in St. Mary Mead with grand plans and grander smiles. There had been Mr. Thompson, the grocer's assistant, who'd swindled half the village out of their savings with promises of a new cooperative. And then there was that curate, years ago, whose earnest sermons hid a penchant for pilfering from the church collection. Charm, Miss Marple had learned, was often a mask for something less savory. She glanced out the tea shop window, where the lane stretched toward the hill where Ashfield Manor stood. The house, a sprawling Georgian affair with ivy-clad walls and tall chimneys, had been empty for years, its gardens overgrown and its windows dark. The news of a new tenant had stirred the village, and Mr. Victor Langston's arrival had been the talk of every parlor and pub for days. Miss Marple had not yet met the man, but she had seen him from a distance, a tall figure in a well-cut suit, striding confidently through the village with a hat tilted just so. There was something about him, she thought, that reminded her of a character from one of Raymond's novels, polished, but perhaps too polished, like a coin that shone too brightly to be entirely genuine. The bell above the tea-shop door jingled, and Miss Marple's attention shifted. A young woman entered, her cheeks flushed and her eyes bright with purpose. It was Lily, Miss Marple's maid, a girl of 19 with a quick mind and an unfortunate tendency to chatter. She hurried to Miss Marple's table, clutching a basket of groceries. "Miss Marple, I'm ever so sorry to interrupt," Lily said, her voice low but eager. "I was just at the grocer's, and you'll never guess what I heard. That Mr. Langston, he's ordered enough food and drink for a proper feast at the manor. They say he's invited everyone who's anyone in the village, and some from as far as Much Benham. There's to be music and dancing, and even an auction for that charity of his." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. "Is that so, Lily? How very generous of Mr. Langston. And what else did you hear?" Lily leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Well, Mrs. Henshaw, you know, the widow from Willow Cottage, was there, buying her usual tin of biscuits, and she couldn't stop talking about him. Said he called on her yesterday, all proper like, and told her about the orphanage. She's thinking of donating her late husband's sapphire brooch for the auction. It's worth a fortune, they say." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, though her smile remained. "Mrs. Henshaw's brooch, you say? That is interesting. And what did you think of Mr. Langston, Lily, when you saw him?" Lily hesitated, her brow furrowing. He's very grand, isn't he? All smiles and fine words. But there's something about him, miss. I can't put my finger on it, but he reminds me of my cousin Tom, who used to sell dodgy watches at the market. Always talking like he was your best friend, but you'd check your purse after he left." Miss Marple chuckled softly, her needles resuming their steady rhythm. "A very astute observation, Lily. People are often like patterns in it. Can see the shape of them, but it's the stitches underneath that tell the real story." Lily blinked, clearly unsure what to make of this, but nodded and hurried off to finish her errands. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind turning over the pieces of information she'd gathered. A charming stranger, a grand gala, a valuable brooch, and a village already half in love with the newcomer. It was, she thought, a familiar pattern, one she had seen before in St. Mary Mead and elsewhere. And patterns, as she well knew, had a way of revealing their flaws if you looked closely enough. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her cozy sitting room, the fire crackling in the hearth, and her knitting spread across her lap. The pale blue shawl was coming along nicely, though she'd noticed a small mistake in the pattern, a dropped stitch, easily corrected if caught in time. She smiled to herself, thinking how like life that was. A single misstep, overlooked by most, could unravel everything if left unchecked. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Dolly Bantry, her oldest friend in the village, whose husband, Colonel Bantry, had once owned Ashfield Manor. Dolly swept in, her cheeks rosy from the evening chill, and settled into an armchair with a dramatic sigh. "Jane, you'll never believe the fuss," Dolly exclaimed, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "This Langston fellow has everyone in a tizzy. I've just come from the vicarage, where Mrs. Clement was going on about his plans for the gala. She's convinced he's a saint sent to save the orphans of London. But I'm not so sure. There's something about him that doesn't sit right." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression mild. "Oh, and what makes you say that, Dolly?" Dolly leaned forward, her voice dropping. "It's the way he talks, Jane, all smooth and polished, like he's rehearsed every word. Arthur says I'm being fanciful, but I've seen his type before. Remember that dreadful man who tried to sell us those shares in a gold mine, all charm and no substance?" Miss Marple nodded, her fingers working the needles with practiced ease. "I do remember, and I recall that you were quite right about him in the end. What do you know about Mr. Langston's plans for this gala?" Dolly waved a hand. "Oh, it's to be the event of the season, apparently. Music, dancing, a grand auction. Mrs. Henshaw's brooch is the star of the show, of course. But there's something else. I overheard him talking to Dr. Haydock at the pub, and he mentioned something about securing funds for the future. It sounded, well, not quite charitable, if you know what I mean." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed behind her spectacles. "Indeed, I do. And I think, Dolly, that it might be worth attending this gala. One can learn a great deal by observing people in their element." Dolly laughed, shaking her head. "Jane, you're incorrigible. Are you planning to catch this Langston fellow in some dastardly act? I swear, you see mysteries everywhere." "Not everywhere," Miss Marple replied, her voice soft but firm. "Only where there are people. And people, Dolly, are very rarely what they seem." The following days brought a flurry of activity to St. Mary Mead. Invitations to Mr. Langston's gala arrived in crisp, cream-colored envelopes, each one embossed with a gold crest that looked suspiciously new. The village buzzed with excitement, and even the most skeptical residents like Miss Hartnell found themselves caught up in the anticipation. Dresses were aired out, hats were dusted off, and the local seamstress, Mrs. Bates, was run off her feet with last minute alterations. Miss Marple, however, remained quietly observant. She declined to order a new dress, choosing instead her trusty black lace gown, which she wore with a simple string of pearls. "One doesn't need finery to see clearly," she remarked to Lily, who was helping her pin up her hair. Lily, who had been invited to the gala as part of the serving staff, was practically vibrating with excitement. "They say there'll be a string quartet and lanterns in the garden, and all sorts of fancy food. And Mr. Langston himself will be there, making speeches and charming everyone. Don't you think it's exciting?" Miss Marple smiled, adjusting her shawl. "Very exciting, Lily. And I think we shall both keep our eyes open, don't you? There's often more to a party than meets the eye." The night of the gala arrived, and Ashfield Manor was transformed. Lanterns glowed along the gravel drive, casting warm light on the ivy-clad walls. The windows blazed with light, and the sound of musica, lively waltz, drifted out into the night. Carriages and motor-cars lined the lane, and the villagers, dressed in their finest, streamed into the manor's grand hall. Miss Marple arrived on the arm of her nephew, Raymond West, who had come down from London for the occasion. Raymond, a writer with a flair for the dramatic, was already spinning theories about Langston's motives. "He's probably an eccentric millionaire," Raymond said, adjusting his tie as they entered the hall. "Or perhaps a conman, hiding in plain sight. What do you think, Aunt Jane?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "I think, Raymond, that we shall find out soon enough. Now, do try to enjoy the evening, and don't spill your champagne on Mrs. Henshaw's dress." The hall was a vision of elegance, with chandeliers glittering overhead and long tables laden with crystal and silver. Mr. Victor Langston stood at the center of it all, a tall, handsome man in his early 40s, with dark hair slicked back and a smile that seemed to light up the room. He moved through the crowd with ease, shaking hands, kissing cheeks, and dispensing compliments with the skill of a seasoned actor. Miss Marple watched him closely, noting the way his eyes flicked to the door, as if expecting someone, and the slight tension in his posture when Mrs. Henshaw approached. Mrs. Henshaw, resplendent in a sapphire blue gown, was clutching a velvet box that Miss Marple knew contained the famous brooch. She presented it to Langston with a flourish, her voice carrying over the music. "For the auction, Mr. Langston," she said, her cheeks flushed. "My late husband would have wanted it to go to a good cause. I trust you'll see it fetches a fine price for the orphans." Langston took the box, his smile dazzling. "My dear Mrs. Henshaw, your generosity is an inspiration. This brooch will be the centerpiece of our auction, I assure you. The children will be forever grateful." Miss Marple, standing nearby with a glass of lemonade, noticed the way Langston's fingers lingered on the box, his eyes gleaming with something that was not entirely charitable. She also noticed a man in the corner of the room, dressed in a dark suit and standing apart from the crowd. He was watching Langston intently, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. There was something familiar about him, Miss Marple thought, though she couldn't place him. As the evening wore on, the music grew livelier, and the guests began to dance. Miss Marple, content to sit by the wall with her knitting, observed the interactions around her. She saw Mrs. Price giggling with Langston over a glass of champagne, Miss Hartnell frowning at the extravagance of the decorations, and Dr. Haydock deep in conversation with a young man who seemed nervous, his hands fidgeting with his cufflinks. It was during the auction that the evening took a turn. The auctioneer, a jovial man from Much Benham, called for the sapphire brooch to be brought forward. Langston stepped onto the small stage, holding the velvet box aloft. The crowd murmured in anticipation as he opened it with a flourishingly to freeze, his smile faltering. The box was empty. A gasp rippled through the room. Mrs. Henshaw clutched her throat, her face pale. "My brooch," she cried. "It was there when I gave it to you, Mr. Langston." Langston recovered quickly, his voice smooth. "My dear lady, there must be some mistake. Perhaps it was misplaced during the preparations. We shall search the manor at once." The guests buzzed with speculation, and Miss Marple's needles stilled. She watched as Langston signaled to a servant, a young man with a sharp face and quick movements. The servant hurried off, ostensibly to search for the brooch, But Miss Marple noticed that Langston's eyes followed him with a look of urgency. Interesting, she murmured to herself, tucking her knitting into her bag. She rose, her movements slow but deliberate, and made her way toward Mrs. Henshaw, who was being comforted by Mrs. Puddicombe. There, Clara, Mrs. Puddicombe was saying. It's probably just been misplaced, like Mr. Langston said. These things happen. Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on Mrs. Henshaw's arm. I'm sure it will be found, she said, her voice soothing. But tell me, Mrs. Henshaw, when did you last see the brooch? Before you gave it to Mr. Langston. I mean, Mrs. Henshaw sniffled, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. I checked it just before I came, Miss Marple. It was in the box, safe and sound. I handed it to him myself, not an hour ago. Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. And did anyone else handle the box after you gave it to him? No, I don't think so, Mrs. Henshaw said, frowning. He took it straight to the auction table. Oh, what a dreadful thing. That brooch was all I had left of my husband's legacy. Miss Marple patted her hand, her expression sympathetic, but her eyes sharp. She glanced across the room, where Langston was now speaking to the auctioneer, his gestures animated but controlled. The man in the dark suit was gone, she noted, and the servant Langston had signaled to had not returned. As the gala continued, albeit with a damper on the festivities, Miss Marple slipped out into the garden, where the lanterns cast long shadows. Across the lawn, the air was cool, and she pulled her shawl closer, her mind turning over the events of the evening. The missing brooch, Langston's quick deflection, the mysterious man in the corner. It was all part of a pattern, she was sure of it. And patterns, as she had told Lily, always revealed themselves in time. She paused by the garden gate, her eyes catching a glint of something in the grass. Bending down, she picked up a small scrap of paper, torn at the edges. In the dim light of a lantern, she could just make out the words, "Meet at midnight, Old Oak." Miss Marple folded the paper carefully and tucked it into her pocket. She glanced toward the old oak tree at the edge of the manor's grounds, its gnarled branches silhouetted against the night sky. A smile touched her lips, and she murmured to herself, well, Mr. Langston, what are you up to, I wonder?" As she returned to the manor, the music and laughter seemed distant, overshadowed by the puzzle taking shape in her mind. The gala might be the talk of St. Mary Mead, but Miss Marple suspected that the real story was only just beginning. Chapter 2. The Charity. Gala. Evening air in St. Mary Mead carried a crisp autumn bite, softened by the warm glow of lanterns strung across the grounds of Ashfield Manor. The grand old house, with its ivy-clad walls and towering chimneys, stood resplendent under the twilight sky, its windows ablaze with light. Mr. Victor Langston, the manor's new tenant, had transformed the estate into a spectacle for his charity gala, an event the village had buzzed about for weeks. The promise of aiding a distant orphanage had drawn the good folk of St. Mary Mead, their pockets ready to open for a noble cause. Miss Jane Marple, however, attended with a different purpose, her sharp eyes hidden behind a serene smile as she stepped into the throng, her knitting bag tucked under her arm. The manor's ballroom was a vision of opulence, its polished oak floors reflecting the chandelier's sparkle. Tables draped in white linen bore silver trays of delicate sandwiches, petits fours, and crystal flutes fizzing with champagne. A small orchestra played a lively waltz, and villagers mingled with strangers from neighboring towns, their laughter rising above the music. Langston had spared no expense, and the villagers, unaccustomed to such grandeur, were enchanted. Mrs. Clara Henshaw, a widow of considerable means, stood near the center of the room, her cheeks flushed as she chatted with Langston himself. Her sapphire brooch, a family heirloom donated for the evening's auction, glinted on her velvet shawl, catching the eye of every passer-by. Miss Marple settled into a cushioned chair near a tall window, her fingers absently working the needles of her knitting. She wore a simple black dress with a laced collar, her silver hair neatly pinned, blending effortlessly with the crowd. Yet her gaze roamed, noting every detail: the footman's stiff postures, the guests' eager chatter, and Langston's effortless charm as he glided from group to group. He was a tall man, perhaps in his late 30s, with dark hair slicked back and a smile that seemed to promise secrets. His tailored suit fit impeccably, and his voice carried a smooth, almost theatrical cadence. To the villagers, he was a dashing philanthropist, but to Miss Marple, he recalled a grocer's assistant from years past, a man whose charm had masked a penchant for pilfering. As the evening progressed, Langston took the stage, a raised platform at the room's far end. The orchestra fell silent, and he raised a glass, his eyes sweeping the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice warm and commanding, "tonight is not merely a celebration, but a call to compassion. The children of St. Anne's orphanage depend on us. Your generosity will light their path to a brighter future." The crowd applauded, Mrs. Henshaw clapping with particular fervor. Miss Marple's needles paused as she watched Langston's hands, noting their slight tremor, a flicker of nerves beneath his polished exterior. The auction began, with Langston presenting each item with flourish. A silver tea set fetched a tidy sum, followed by a pair of antique candlesticks. Then came the sapphire brooch, carried on a velvet cushion by a young footman. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the gem caught the chandelier light, its deep blue facets sparkling like a star. "A treasure from Mrs. Henshaw's own collection," Langston announced, bowing to the widow, who blushed and waved a hand. Bidding was brisk, with offers climbing until a portly gentleman from Chipping Cleghorn secured it for a staggering £300. The brooch was returned to the cushion, and the footman carried it to a side table for safekeeping under the watchful eye of Langston's steward. Mr. Gibbs, Miss Marple's attention drifted to the guests. Mrs. Bantry, her friend and neighbor, stood nearby, her loud laugh cutting through the hum of conversation. "Isn't it marvelous, Jane?" she said, approaching with a glass of sherry. "Such a generous man, this Mr. Langston, and so handsome." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes flicking to Langston, who was now escorting Mrs. Henshaw to the dance floor. "Generous, indeed," she murmured, her tone neutral. Mrs. Bantry prattled on about the manor's renovations, but Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere, cataloguing the evening's oddities, the footman's nervous glance as he placed the brooch, Gibbs's quick step to stand beside it, and Langston's frequent looks toward the side table. As the waltz ended, a murmur spread through the crowd. The side table was empty, the sapphire brooch was gone. Guests turned to one another, their whispers growing frantic. Langston, his face a mask of concern, hurried to the table, Gibbs at his heels. "A misunderstanding, surely," he said loudly, raising his hands for calm. "The brooch must have been misplaced. Please, enjoy the evening while we investigate. His voice was steady, but Miss Marple noted the tightness in his jaw, the way his eyes darted to the footman, who stood pale and rigid. The crowd's unease lingered, but Langston's charm worked its magic. The orchestra struck up again, and guests returned to their conversations, though their glances strayed to the empty table. Miss Marple, however, remained seated, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically. She watched as Langston conferred with Gibbs in a corner, their heads bent close. Gibbs shook his head, and Langston's hand gripped his arm briefly before he turned back to the guests. His smile restored. Mrs. Henshaw, visibly shaken, approached him, her voice trembling as she asked about her brooch. Langston took her hand, his tone soothing, promising a thorough search. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. His reassurances were too quick, too practiced. She rose, her movements slow and deliberate, and approached Mrs. Bantry, who was now gossiping with Mrs. Price, the vicar's wife. A dreadful thing, Mrs. Price was saying, clutching her pearls. That brooch was worth a fortune. Do you think one of the servants? She trailed off, glancing at the footman. Miss Marple joined them, her expression mild. People are quick to blame servants, she said softly, but theft often requires opportunity and planning. Mrs. Bantry raised an eyebrow. Jane, you don't think? Miss Marple shook her head, her smile disarming. I think very little, Dolly. I only observe. As the evening wound down, guests began to depart, their chatter now dominated by the theft. Langston stood at the manor's grand entrance, bidding each farewell with a handshake or a bow. Miss Marple lingered, watching him closely. His eyes met hers for a moment, and she saw a flicker of something calculation, perhaps before his smile widened. Miss Marple, I hope you enjoyed the evening, despite this unfortunate incident, he said, his voice smooth as silk. Very much, Mr. Langston, she replied, her tone polite but cool. You've given us much to think about. He inclined his head, and she stepped into the cool night, her mind already turning over the evening's events back at her cottage. Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting in her lap. The gala had been a performance, and Langston was its star. But performances, she knew, often hid truths. The brooch's disappearance was no accident. It was too convenient, too neatly timed. She thought of the grocer's assistant again, a man who'd stolen from his employer while smiling at customers. Langston's charm, his quick deflection of blame, his attention to Mrs. Henshaw pointed to a pattern. Miss Marple's needles clicked faster. She would need to watch him closely, for St. Mary Mead, she suspected, was only the beginning of his game. The next morning, the village was abuzz with talk of the theft. At the tea shop, Miss Marple listened as Mrs. Price recounted the Gala's splendor, her voice dropping to a whisper when she mentioned the brooch. They say it was a servant, but I saw that footman young Tom, wasn't it? Looking awfully guilty, she said. Miss Marple sipped her tea, saying nothing. Tom, she knew, was a local lad, honest but easily flustered. Langston's suggestion of a servant's guilt had taken root, just as he'd intended, she thought. Of the footprint she'd noticed near the manor's garden gate the previous week, too refined for a gardener's boot. It hadn't struck her as significant then, but now it nagged at her. A piece of the puzzle yet to fit. She left the tea shop and strolled toward Ashfield Manor, her pace leisurely, but her eyes sharp. The manor's grounds were quiet now, the lanterns gone, the glamour of the gala replaced by the ordinary bustle of servants cleaning up. She paused near the garden gate, her gaze falling to the spot where she'd seen the footprint. The earth was disturbed, but the mark was gone, smoothed over by a gardener or, perhaps, someone more deliberate. She frowned, her mind tracing back to Langston's behavior at the gala, his glances at the side table, his quick conference with Gibbs, his soothing words to Mrs. Henshaw. Mrs. Henshaw herself appeared at that moment, walking briskly down the Manor's drive, her face pale. "Miss Marple," she called, hurrying over. "I'm at my wit's end. That brooch was my mother's, you know, and now Mr. Langston says it may be lost forever." Her hands twisted together, and Miss Marple patted her arm gently. There, Clara. Things have a way of turning up. Tell me, has Mr. Langston said anything more about his plans for the orphanage?" Mrs. Henshaw brightened slightly. "He's promised to match every pound raised last night. He's even asked me to invest in a new venture shipping business, he says, to fund the orphanage further." Miss Marple's expression remained unchanged, but her mind raced. A shipping business, Langston's frequent trips to London, his polished charm, the missing brooch, all pointed to something larger than a single theft. She recalled a case years ago, a charming man in St. Mary Mead who'd swindled half the village with promises of investment returns. He, too, had been fond of grand gestures and quick exits. "Be careful, Clara," she said softly. "Generosity can sometimes hide other motives." Mrs. Henshaw looked puzzled, but nodded, promising to think it over. As Miss Marple walked home, the village seemed quieter, the autumn leaves rustling underfoot. Langston's gala had dazzled St. Mary Mead, but it had also left a shadow: the missing brooch, the whispers of theft, the unease that lingered beneath the village's chatter. Miss Marple's knitting needles would click late into the night, her thoughts weaving a pattern as intricate as her wool. Langston was no ordinary scoundrel, she was certain, and the gala was only the opening act of his scheme. She would need to be patient, observant, and perhaps a little cunning herself to unravel it. Chapter 3. Whispers of Doubt. The morning after the charity gala at Ashfield Manor, St. Mary Mead buzzed with a peculiar energy, as if the village itself had caught a fever of speculation. The theft of the sapphire brooch, a dazzling piece donated by the late Mrs. Winthrop's estate for the auction, was the sole topic of conversation. It wasn't just the value of the jewel, though its deep blue facets had sparkled under the chandelier's glow, drawing gasps from the gala's attendees, but the audacity of the act. A theft in St. Mary Mead, under the noses of its most respectable citizens. The villagers, from the butcher to the postmistress, spun theories as freely as they traded gossip over garden fences. Miss Jane Marple, however, sat quietly in her cottage, her knitting needles clicking with their usual steady rhythm. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains, casting delicate patterns across the parlor's worn but polished furniture. Her hands moved with practiced ease, looping soft wool into neat rows, but her mind was far from the scarf taking shape on her lap. She was thinking of Mr. Victor Langston, the charming newcomer who had swept into St. Mary Mead like a summer breeze, only to leave a storm of suspicion in his wake. She had attended the gala the previous evening, not because she cared for such lavish affairs. Miss Marple preferred simpler gatherings, a quiet tea with friends, or a church social, but because she knew the value of observation. People revealed themselves in crowds. She had learned, long ago, when they thought no one was paying close attention, and Miss Marple always paid attention. At the gala, she had sat in a corner, her modest black dress blending into the shadows, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles. She had watched Langston glide through the room, his tailored suit impeccable, his smile as polished as the silverware. He had charmed the guests with ease, particularly Mrs. Clara Henshaw, the widow whose fortune was as substantial as her trust in others. Mrs. Henshaw had been radiant, her laughter ringing out as Langston regaled her with tales of his travels. Miss Marple had noted the way he leaned in just a fraction too close, the way his hand lingered on hers when he passed her a glass of champagne. It was subtle, calculated, and it reminded Miss Marple of a grocer's assistant she had known years ago in St. Mary Mead, a young man named Harold, who had a smile like sunshine but a habit of short-changing customers when he thought they weren't looking. Harold had left the village abruptly, pursued by whispers of missing funds. Langston's charm, Miss Marple thought, had that same practiced edge, like a blade hidden in velvet. The theft of the brooch had occurred sometime during the auction's chaos, when bids were flying and attention was scattered. Langston had been masterful in his response, expressing shock and outrage, his voice carrying just the right note of indignation. He had suggested, with a regretful shake of his head, that one of the manor's temporary staffer footmen hired for the evening have succumbed to temptation. The villagers had nodded, eager to believe his explanation, for who could suspect a man so generous, so devoted to charity? But Miss Marple had noticed how quickly he deflected blame, how smoothly he redirected the conversation. It was the kind of maneuver that required rehearsal, and it set her mind turning now. As she sat in her parlor, she sipped her morning tea and considered the matter. The brooch was no trinket. Its value was enough to tempt a thief, but its theft required opportunity and nerve. Langston had been everywhere that evening, mingling, directing servants, overseeing the auction. He had the run of the manor, and he knew its layout better than anyone save the housekeeper, Mrs. Gibbs, who had been with Ashfield Manor for decades. Could he have slipped away unnoticed? Miss Marple's needles paused as she pictured the gala's layout, the grand hall with its glittering chandeliers, the side rooms where guests wandered, the servants' passages that connected the manor's sprawling wings. A man like Langston, quick and clever, could have used those passages to his advantage. She set her knitting aside and rose, smoothing her skirt. It was time to pay a visit to her friend Dolly Bantry, who had a knack for picking up village gossip without even trying. Dolly lived at Gossington Hall, a short walk from Miss Marple's cottage, and her morning tea was always accompanied by a lively recounting of St. Mary Mead's latest scandals. If anyone had heard whispers about the theft or about Langston, Dolly would know. The walk to Gossington Hall was pleasant, the late summer air warm and fragrant with the scent of roses. St. Mary Mead lay quiet under the morning sun, its thatched cottages and tidy gardens giving no hint of the unease that simmered beneath the surface. Miss Marple nodded to Mrs. Price, who was sweeping her doorstep, and exchanged a few words with young Tommy, the butcher's boy, who was cycling past with a delivery. By the time she reached Gossington Hall, her mind was already sorting through the threads of the mystery. Like wool to be untangled. Dolly Bantry greeted her with a delighted cry, ushering her into the drawing room where a tray of tea and scones awaited. Dolly was a robust woman, her face ruddy from years of gardening, and her laughter as hearty as ever. "Jane, you're just in time," she exclaimed, pouring tea into delicate china cups. "The whole village is in an uproar about that wretched brooch. Can you believe it? Stolen right under our noses." Miss Marple smiled faintly, accepting a cup. "It's most unsettling," she agreed, her tone mild. "What are people saying, Dolly? I've been rather out of the loop this morning." Dolly's eyes sparkled with the thrill of gossip. "Oh, everything and anything. Mrs. Price swears it was one of those hired footman shifty eyes. She says, though I don't know how she could tell from across the room. Mr. Clement, the vicar, thinks it's a sign of moral decline, though he always thinks that. And Mrs. Henshaw, poor dear, was nearly in tears, saying how dreadful it is that Mr. Langston's charity should suffer such a scandal. She's quite taken with him, you know." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression unchanged, but her mind alert. "Yes, I noticed that at the gala. Mr. Langston seems to have a way with people, doesn't he just?" Dolly leaned forward, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Mind you, Jane, I'm not one to judge, but there's something about him that's a bit too perfect. Arthur says I'm being fanciful, but you know how men are. They never see what's right in front of them." Miss Marple's lips twitched, a faint smile. Colonel Bantry, Dolly's husband, was a kind man, but not the most observant, especially when it came to human nature. "I suppose Mr. Langston has been quite generous with his time and money," she said carefully. "But generosity can sometimes mask other intentions. Do you recall that business with Mr. Hargreaves years ago?" Dolly's brow furrowed. "Hargreaves? Oh, that dreadful man who ran off with the church restoration fund. What made you think of him?" Miss Marple's needles, which she had brought along in her bag, clicked softly as she resumed knitting. "Only that he, too, was very charming, and very quick to point fingers elsewhere when questions were asked. I wonder if anyone has looked into Mr. Langston's background. A man who appears so suddenly, with such wealth and polish, must have a story." Dolly's eyes widened. "Jane, you don't think—" "Oh, but surely not. He's been so kind, hosting that gala, raising all that money for the orphanage," though she hesitated, tapping her teaspoon against her saucer. "Mrs. Gibbs did mention something odd. She said Langston's been awfully particular about the Manor's staff, insisting on hiring his own people for the gala. Said he didn't trust locals to handle such an important event. I thought it was a bit high-handed, but then, he's from London, isn't he? They're different there." Miss Marple nodded, filing the information away. Langston's choice of staff was curious, especially if one of them was now being blamed for the theft. It was a convenient way to divert suspicion, and it suggested a man who planned his moves carefully. "Did Mrs. Gibbs say anything else?" she asked. "Not much," Dolly admitted. "Only that he's been receiving a lot of post from London, and parcels, almost daily. She thought it was business, but you know how she is, always poking about. Oh, and she said he's been taking late-night walks out toward the old oak tree by the Manor's boundary. Said it was queer, a gentleman like him wandering about in the dark." Miss Marple's needles paused again, just for a moment. The old oak tree was a landmark in St. Mary Mead, its gnarled branches a favorite haunt for children playing hide-and-seek. It was also isolated, far from prying eyes, the perfect place for a clandestine meeting. "That is interesting," she murmured. "Very interesting indeed." Dolly, sensing a shift in her friend's tone, leaned closer. "Jane, you've got that look. What are you thinking? Is it something dreadful?" Miss Marple chuckled softly. "Nothing so dramatic, Dolly. I'm only wondering about Mr. Langston's habits. A man so busy with charity work must have little time for midnight strolls, unless there's a reason for them." Dolly clapped her hands, delighted. "You're sleuthing again, aren't you? Oh, Jane, you must tell me everything. Do you think he stole the brooch? Or, oh heavens, is he some sort of criminal mastermind?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "You've been reading too many of Raymond's novels, Dolly. I'm only curious, that's all. But I think I shall take a walk myself this afternoon. Perhaps near Ashfield Manor. The gardens are lovely this time of year." Dolly laughed, but her curiosity was piqued. "You'll let me know if you find anything, won't you? I shan't breathe a word." Deflection, his choice of staff, his late-night walks all pointed to a man with something to hide. She thought again of Harold, the grocer's assistant, whose charm had masked a calculating nature. Harold had been caught when a customer, sharper than most, noticed a discrepancy in her change and raised the alarm. Miss Marple wondered if Langston, too, had left a trail of discrepancies, waiting to be noticed by someone with the patience to look, that afternoon. She donned her sensible walking shoes and a light shawl, her straw hat tilted to shield her eyes from the sun. She carried her knitting bag, a prop that made her seem harmless, just an elderly spinster out for a stroll. Her destination was the lane that ran alongside Ashfield Manor's grounds, where the old oak tree stood sentinel. The manor itself was a grand affair, its stone facade softened by ivy, its windows gleaming in the sunlight. Miss Marple walked slowly, pausing now and then to admire a flower bed or wave to a passing villager. To anyone watching, she was simply enjoying the day, but her eyes were scanning the ground, the hedges, the gate that led to the manor's gardens. Near the gate, she paused, her gaze caught by a patch of earth that looked recently disturbed. She knelt, as if to adjust her shoe, and studied the ground. There, half hidden by grass, was a footprint, not the heavy tread of a gardener's boot, but the sharp outline of a gentleman's shoe, narrow and polished. It was fresh, no more than a day old, and it lay near a scrap of paper caught in the hedge. Miss Marple retrieved the paper with care, unfolding it to reveal a few scrawled words: "Meet at midnight, Old Oak." Her heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. The note was torn, its edges ragged, as if discarded in haste. She tucked it into her knitting bag, her mind racing. A midnight meeting at the old oak. Dolly's gossip about Langston's late-night walks suddenly took on new significance. Was he meeting someone there? A confederate, perhaps? Or a buyer for the stolen brooch? Miss Marple straightened, brushing dirt from her hands, and continued her walk, her thoughts as orderly as the stitches in her knitting. Back at her cottage, she sat by the window, the note spread out before her. The handwriting was bold, masculine, but unremarkable, nothing to identify its author. Yet the words themselves were a clue, a thread to follow. She thought of Langston's frequent trips to London, mentioned casually by Mrs. Gibbs. Were they business, as he claimed, or something more sinister? And the brooch, had it been stolen for profit, or was it part of a larger scheme? Miss Marple's nephew, Raymond West, arrived that evening for a visit, his typewriter tucked under his arm. Raymond was a writer, fond of grand ideas and modern theories, and he often teased his aunt for her old-fashioned ways. But he respected her mind, even if he didn't always admit it. Over dinner, Miss Marple mentioned the theft, keeping her tone light. "Really, Aunt Jane," Raymond said, slicing into his roast, "you're not getting caught up in village gossip, are you? It's probably just some petty thief taking advantage of the Gala's chaos." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her eyes on her plate. "But I wonder about Mr. Langston. He seems rather too good to be true." Raymond laughed. "You see villains everywhere, don't you? He's just a city fellow, playing lord of the manor. Probably pinched the brooch himself to fund his next charity stunt." Miss Marple smiled, letting him think she was amused. Raymond's skepticism was useful. It kept her grounded, forced her to question her own assumptions. But she couldn't shake the feeling that Langston was more than a city fellow with a flair for dramatics. The footprint, the note, the stolen brooch, they were pieces of a puzzle, and Miss Marple was determined to fit them together. The next morning, she began her inquiries in earnest. She visited the post office, where Miss Hartnell, the postmistress, was only too happy to chat. "Oh, Mr. Langston's letters," Miss Hartnell said, sorting envelopes with practiced speed. "He gets a fair few, mostly from London. Business, I expect. Though there was one from a place called Brighthaven that not a soul in St. Mary Mead's heard of it." Miss Marple thanked her, storing the name away. Brighthaven was a coastal town not far from St. Mary Mead, known for its quiet harbor and fishing boats. It was an unlikely destination for a man like Langston, unless he had business that required discretion. She made a mental note to mention it to Sir Henry Clithering when next she saw him. Her next stop was the tea shop, where Mrs. Price and Mrs. Weatherby were deep in conversation about the theft. Miss Marple joined them, her knitting in hand, and listened as they dissected the Gala's events. Mrs. Price was adamant that the footman was to blame, while Mrs. Weatherby wondered if the brooch had been misplaced rather than stolen. Miss Marple said little, but her ears caught every word, every hint of doubt or suspicion. By the afternoon she had gathered enough to confirm her unease. Langston's charm had won over the village, but there were cracks in his facades, small things, like his insistence on his own staff, his late-night walks, his letters from Brighthaven, and then there was Mrs. Henshaw, whose devotion to Langston bordered on reckless. Miss Marple had seen it before, in women like Mrs. Henshaw, who were lonely and vulnerable, easy prey for a man with a silver tongue. As evening fell, Miss Marple sat in her parlor, her knitting forgotten on her lap. The note lay on the table, its words stark in the lamplight. "Meet at midnight, Old Oak." She thought of the footprint, the stolen brooch, the whispers of doubt that threaded through the village. Langston was clever, but cleverness often led to carelessness. He had left clues, small but telling, and Miss Marple was determined to follow them. She rose, her movements brisk despite her age, and fetched her coat. There was work to be done, and St. Mary Mead, for all its sleepy charm, was no stranger to secrets. Miss Marple knew that human nature, like the wool she knitted, followed patterns that could be unraveled with patience and care, and she had plenty of both. The days that followed were a quiet flurry of activity. Miss Marple moved through the village with her usual unobtrusive grace, asking questions that seemed innocent, listening to gossip that seemed trivial. She spoke to Mrs. Gibbs, who confirmed Langston's late-night walks and mentioned a locked room in the manner that no servant was allowed to enter. She chatted with the vicar, who admitted that Langston's donations to the church had been generous, but curiously irregular. She even visited Mrs. Henshaw, offering sympathy for the Gala scandal and gently probing about Langston's promises of investment returns. Mrs. Henshaw, flustered but trusting, revealed that she had lent Langston a substantial sum, nearly £5,000, for his charity. He had assured her it would double in value within a year, invested in a mysterious venture he called a sure thing. Miss Marple's heart sank, though her face showed only concern. She remembered a village swindler years ago who had made similar promises to widows and spinsters, only to vanish with their savings. She cautioned Mrs. Henshaw to be careful, but she kept her suspicions to herself. To accuse Langston now, without proof, would only alert him. Instead, she focused on the old oak tree. She enlisted Lily, her young maid, to keep watch near the manor's grounds after dark. Lily, eager for adventure, agreed, though she was nervous about lurking in the shadows. Miss Marple gave her strict instructions: stay hidden, listen carefully, and report anything unusual. "You're a brave girl, Lily," she said, patting her hand. "And you've got sharp eyes, just like my old friend Elsie, who once spotted a poacher in her father's orchard." Lily returned the next morning, her face pale with excitement. She had seen Langston, she said, near the old oak tree, just past midnight. He had been speaking to a rough-looking fellow, not from the village inn, hushed, urgent tones. She hadn't caught much, only snatches of words. Shipman, docks, careful. The man had left quickly, disappearing into the woods, and Langston had returned to the manor, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting to be followed. Miss Marple listened intently, her mind piecing together the fragments. A shipment docks, a clandestine meeting, it suggested something far larger than a stolen brooch. Smuggling, perhaps, or something worse. She thought of Brighthaven, the coastal town, and the heavy parcels Langston received. Was he moving stolen goods through St. Mary Mead, using the village's innocence as a shield? The idea was audacious, but Miss Marple had seen audacity before, in men who thought themselves untouchable. She thanked Lily, giving her an extra day off for her bravery, and sat down to plan her next move. Sir Henry Clithering, her old friend from Scotland Yard, would be her next ally. He had retired to St. Mary Mead, but still had contacts in London, men who could dig into Langston's past. She wrote him a letter, careful to keep it vague, mentioning only her curiosity about a newcomer and a possible connection to a coastal town. Sir Henry would understand, she knew. He had always trusted her instincts. As she sealed the letter, Miss Marple glanced at the note from the hedge, its words now committed to memory. "Meet at midnight, Old Oak." It was a small thing, a scrap of paper, but it was a start. And Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence and her knack for seeing what others missed, knew that small things could unravel the grandest schemes. The village continued its chatter. Oblivious to the storm brewing in its midst, Mrs. Price gossiped about the footman, Mrs. Weatherby fretted over the brooch, and Mrs. Henshaw dreams. Chapter 4. A Clue in the Garden. Miss Jane Marple stepped lightly along the winding path that skirted the edge of Ashfield Manor's sprawling grounds. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the neatly trimmed lawn, and the air was thick with the scent of roses and freshly turned earth. Her black lace-up shoes crunched softly on the gravel, and she adjusted the brim of her sensible straw hat to shield her eyes from the glare. In her hand she carried a small basket, ostensibly for gathering wildflowers, but her true purpose was far less innocent. The theft of the sapphire brooch at the charity gala had set her mind worry, and her instincts, honed by years of observing the subtle missteps of human nature, told her that Mr. Victor Langston was not the charming philanthropist he appeared to be. The manor loomed ahead, its ivy-clad walls and tall chimneys exuding an air of grandeur that felt slightly out of place in the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple paused near a low stone wall, her sharp eyes scanning the garden. Beyond, the flower beds were meticulously maintained, with dahlias and chrysanthemums arranged in precise rows, but her attention was drawn to the narrow gate at the far end of the garden, half hidden by a tangle of honeysuckle. It was an unobtrusive spot easily overlooked by anyone not paying close attention, and Miss Marple was nothing if not attentive. She approached the gate, her steps deliberate but unhurried, as if she were merely an elderly spinster admiring the blooms. Kneeling to inspect a patch of lavender, she let her gaze drift to the ground near the gate. There, in the soft earth, was a footprint, clear, distinct, and entirely out of place. It was too small and too refined for a gardener's heavy boot, the edges sharp and the tread suggesting a gentleman's shoe, polished and expensive. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, a faint smile of recognition. She had seen such footprints before, left by men who moved with purpose and secrecy, men who did not belong where they tread. As she straightened, her fingers brushed against something caught in the honeysuckle vines. She tugged gently, and a scrap of paper came free, its edges torn and slightly damp from the morning dew. Holding it to the light, she squinted at the faint, penciled words, "Meet at midnight, Old Oak." The handwriting was hurried, the letters uneven, as if written in haste or under duress. Miss Marple tucked the scrap into her basket, covering it with a few sprigs of lavender. Her mind was already racing, connecting the note to the footprint to Langston, and Langston to the missing brooch. It was a puzzle, and she was determined to fit the pieces together. She continued her walk, circling the manor's perimeter, her eyes darting to every shadow, every rustle in the bushes. The garden was quiet, save for the distant hum of bees and the occasional chirp of a sparrow. Yet Miss Marple felt a prickle of unease, the same instinct that had warned her years ago when a grocer's assistant in St. Mary Mead had swindled half the village with his false promises of investment schemes. Langston's charm, his too perfect manners, reminded her of that young man's smooth words, hiding a sharp edge. As she rounded a corner, she spotted Mrs. Norris, the manor's housekeeper, tending to a rosebush. The woman was stout, with a face like a weathered apple, and her hands moved with the efficiency of someone who had spent years keeping order. Miss Marple approached, her expression one of mild curiosity. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Norris," she said, her voice soft and unassuming. "The gardens are looking splendid. Mr. Langston must be pleased with your work." Mrs. Norris straightened, brushing dirt from her apron. "Oh, Miss Marple, you're kind to say so. Mr. Langston don't much notice the gardens, truth be told. Always coming and going, he is, with his grand plans and his London trips." London trips. Miss Marple tilted her head, as if the thought had only just occurred to her. "He must be a busy man, with all his charitable work. Mrs. Norris sniffed, her lips tightening. Charity, he calls it. I reckon he's got other business, though he don't share it with the likes of me. Always locking his study, he is, and I've seen him out here at odd hours, pacing by that old oak tree yonder. Miss Marple followed her gaze to a gnarled oak at the edge of the property, its branches heavy with age. The tree stood alone, its roots twisting into the ground like ancient fingers. She made a mental note of its position, her thoughts circling back to the cryptic note in her basket. How curious, she murmured. I suppose a man like Mr. Langston has many responsibilities. Mrs. Norris nodded, but her eyes narrowed slightly, as if she, too, harbored doubts. Miss Marple thanked her and moved on, her mind buzzing with possibilities. The oak tree, the footprint, the note-all pointed to something clandestine, something Langston wished to keep hidden, but what? And how did it connect to the sapphire brooch? Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her favorite armchair, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she pondered. The parlor was cozy, with chintz curtains and a small fire crackling in the hearth. On the table beside her lay the scrap of paper, its words staring up at her like a challenge. She had no intention of confronting Langston directly, not yet. Men like him were slippery, quick to deflect and charm their way out of suspicion. No, she would need more evidence, something concrete to tie him to the theft and whatever else he was planning. Her nephew, Raymond West, arrived shortly after tea, his city suit slightly rumpled from the train journey. He was a writer, prone to grand ideas and a touch of arrogance, but he adored his aunt and never failed to visit when passing through St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple greeted him warmly, pouring tea from a delicate porcelain pot. Aunt Jane, Raymond said, settling onto the sofa. You look positively conspiratorial. What's got you so preoccupied? Another village scandal? Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling. Nothing so dramatic, Raymond. Just a little puzzle I'm trying to solve. Tell me, what do you make of Mr. Langston, the new tenant at Ashfield Manor? Raymond raised an eyebrow. Langston seems a decent sort. Threw that big gala, didn't he? Everyone's talking about it, though I heard something about a stolen brooch. Surely you don't think he's involved? I don't think anything yet, but I did find something curious near the manor today. A footprint that doesn't belong, and a note about a midnight meeting. It's probably nothing, but Raymond laughed, shaking his head. Aunt Jane, you and your mysteries. You'll have Langston pegged as a master criminal next, all because of a footprint. It was probably one of the gardeners sneaking a cigarette. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, her needles clicking faster. But gardeners don't wear polished leather shoes, and they don't leave notes about midnight meetings under oak trees. Raymond's laughter faded, replaced by a look of reluctant intrigue. You're serious, aren't you? What do you think he's up to? I'm not sure, Miss Marple admitted, but I intend to find out. People like Mr. Langston, Raymond, they rely on charm to hide their flaws. I've seen it before. A curate, years ago, who convinced half the village to invest in a non-existent orphanage. He had the same polished smile. Raymond leaned forward, his skepticism softening. You're incorrigible, Aunt Jane. But if you're right, what's next? You can't exactly stake out the manor yourself. Miss Marple's eyes sparkled. Oh, I have my ways. I've asked young Lily to keep an eye on things. She's sharp, that girl, and she knows how to stay out of sight, Raymond groaned. You're roping your maid into this, Aunt Jane? You're going to get yourself into trouble one of these days. Nonsense, Miss Marple said, setting her knitting aside. Trouble finds those who aren't prepared. I, on the other hand, am always prepared. As Raymond left, promising to check in tomorrow, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her mind weaving a different kind of pattern. The footprint, the note, Mrs. Norris's comments, they were threads in a larger tapestry, one she was determined to unravel. Langston's frequent trips to London, his locked study, his pacing by the oak tree, all suggested a man with secrets, and secrets, Miss Marple knew, had a way of coming to light. That evening she sat by her window, the curtains parted just enough to afford a view of the village lane. The moon hung low, casting a silver glow over St. Mary Mead. She thought of the old oak tree, its branches swaying in the night breeze, and the cryptic note in her basket. Midnight was hours away, but she felt no need to venture out herself. Lily, her young maid, was more than capable of keeping watch, and Miss Marple trusted her to report anything unusual. As the clock struck 9, Miss Marple rose, her movements slow but purposeful. She retrieved a small notebook from her desk, began jotting down her observations, her handwriting neat and precise. The footprint, she noted, was near the garden gate, suggesting someone had entered or left the manor grounds in secret. The note, with its mention of the old oak, pointed to a planned meeting, likely illicit given the hour, and Langston's behavior, his charm, his deflections, his trips to London fit the pattern of a man orchestrating something far more sinister than a charity gala. She paused, her pen hovering over the page. The sapphire brooch was the key. She felt certain its theft was no random act. It was part of a larger scheme, one that Langston was at the center of. But what was he after? Money, certainly Mrs. Henshaw's loan suggested as much, but there was more to it. Something that required midnight meetings and secret footprints. Miss Marple closed her notebook and returned to her knitting, her needles moving in a steady rhythm. She thought of the village, its quiet lanes and gossip-filled tea shops, and how beneath its serene surface lay currents of deceit and ambition. Langston had underestimated St. Mary Mead, she mused, just as others had before him. They saw only a sleepy hamlet, not the sharp-eyed spinster who watched from her cottage window. The next morning, Lily burst into the parlor, her cheeks flushed with excitement. Miss Marple, I saw something last night, she exclaimed, clutching her apron. By the old oak, just like you said. It was Mr. Langston, I'm sure of it, talking to Samuna man, I think, but it was too dark to see his face. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her expression calm but attentive. Go on, Lily. What did you hear? They were arguing, miss, about a shipment or some such. Mr. Langston said something about it being ready soon, but the other man wasn't happy. Said they couldn't afford any more mistakes. Then they heard a twig snap. My fault, I'm afraid. And the other man ran off. Miss Marple nodded, her mind slotting this new piece into the puzzle. You did well, Lily. Did you see where the other man went? Lily shook her head. No, miss. He was too quick, and it was dark. But Mr. Langston went back to the manor, looking right cross. Thank you, Lily, Miss Marple said, patting the girl's hand. You've been a great help. Now, let's keep this between us, shall we? Lily nodded eagerly, her eyes wide with the thrill of conspiracy. As she left to tend to her chores, Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her thoughts racing. A shipment, an argument, a man who fled into the night tit, all pointed to something larger than a stolen brooch. Smuggling, perhaps, or something even more audacious. Langston was playing a dangerous game, and Miss Marple was determined to outwit him. Over the next few days, she continued her quiet investigations, chatting with villagers under the guise of idle gossip. At the tea shop, she learned from Mrs. Price, the postmistress, that Langston received frequent parcels from London, always marked urgent. At the church, the vicar mentioned Langston's generous donations, though he seemed uneasy about the man's insistence on privacy. And at the market, Miss Marple overheard two maids from Ashfield Manor whispering about strange noises in the night footsteps, they said, and the creak of the garden gate. Each tidbit added to the picture, but Miss Marple knew she needed more. She decided to pay another visit to the manor, this time under the pretext of returning a borrowed book to Mrs. Norris. As she approached, she noticed Langston himself in the garden, speaking with a young man she didn't recognize. The man was rough-looking, with a sailor's cap pulled low over his eyes, and their conversation was hushed, their gestures tense. Miss Marple lingered by a hedge, pretending to adjust her shawl. She couldn't hear their words, but she saw Langston hand the man a small package, which he tucked into his jacket before hurrying away. Langston glanced around, his expression guarded, then returned to the manor. Miss Marple made a mental note of the stranger's appearance: broad shoulders, a slight limp, and that distinctive cap. Back at her cottage, she added these details to her notebook, her suspicions growing. The sailor, the package, the midnight meeting, it all suggested a network, one that extended beyond St. Mary Mead. Langston was no petty thief. He was orchestrating something far larger, and the sapphire brooch was merely a piece of it. As the days passed, Miss Marple kept a close eye on Ashfield Manor, enlisting Lily and a few other trusted villagers to report any unusual activity. She learned of Langston's late-night walks, his locked study, and a crate delivered to the manor under cover of darkness. Each clue tightened the net around him, but Miss Marple knew she had to be patient. Langston was clever, and a premature move would only scare him off. One evening, as she sat by her fire, a knock at the door startled her. It was Dolly Bantry, her face flushed with excitement. "Jane, you won't believe it," she exclaimed, bursting into the parlor. "Clara Henshaw just told me she's lent Langston another £500, says he's promised her a share in some investment scheme. I told her she's mad, but she's completely under his spell." Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes narrowing. £500, she murmured. "That's a significant sum. Did she say what the investment was for?" "Something about a shipping venture," Dolly said, flopping onto the sofa. "He's got her believing she'd double her money in a month. Honestly, Jane, the man's a menace. What are you going to do about him?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Do, Dolly? Why, I'm going to have another cup of tea and think. Men like Mr. Langston always overreach, you see. And when they do, they leave tracks I intend to follow." As Dolly chattered on, Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere, piecing together the clues. The footprint, the note, the sailor, the crate, Mrs. Henshaw's money. It was all connected. She was sure of it. Langston was running a scheme, one that relied on his charm and the trust of the villagers. But Miss Marple was not so easily swayed. She would watch, and wait, and when the time was right, she would unravel his deception. Just as she unraveled the tangles in her knitting, the days turned into weeks, and Miss Marple's quiet vigilance continued. She walked past Ashfield Manor daily, noting every detail, the comings and goings of visitors, the delivery of parcels, the flicker of lights in Langston's study late at night. She spoke with Mrs. Norris again, learning that Langston had dismissed one of the maids for asking too many questions about his locked room. She overheard the butcher mention a large order of provisions, far more than one man could need, suggesting Langston was preparing for something significant. Each piece of information was a stitch in the fabric of her case, and Miss Marple was nothing if not meticulous. She knew Langston was planning something, and the old oak tree was at the heart of it. She considered asking Lily to watch again, but decided against it. Langston was growing wary, and another slip could alert him. Instead, she devised a plan to draw him out, one that would rely on his greed and his belief that he could outsmart a village spinster. She began spreading a rumor, subtle and carefully worded, through the village gossip network. At the tea shop, she mentioned to Mrs. Price that she'd heard of a rare diamond hidden in Ashfield Manor's library, a family heirloom overlooked by its previous owners. At the church, she dropped a similar hint to the vicar, knowing his wife would spread the word. Soon, the rumor was circulating, whispered in hushed tones over garden fences, and in the market square Miss Marple watched and waited. 2 nights later, Lily reported seeing Langston near the library window, a flashlight in his hand. He was searching, just as she'd hoped, his greed overriding his caution. Miss Marple, hidden in the shadows with Lily, watched as he slipped inside, his movements quick and silent. She made no move to stop him, not yet. She needed more, something undeniable, to present to Sir Henry Clithering. As Langston emerged, empty-handed but visibly frustrated, Miss Marple retreated, her heart pounding with quiet triumph. The trap was set, and Langston had taken the bait. Now, it was only a matter of time before he made his next move, a move that would lead her to the heart of his scheme, back at her cottage. She sat by the fire, her knitting needles moving steadily. The village was asleep, its secrets hidden in the dark, but Miss Marple was wide awake, her mind as sharp as ever. Langston thought he was in control, but he had underestimated her, just as others had before. She would follow the threads, trace the footprints, and when the moment came, she would bring his deception crashing down. The old oak tree loomed in her thoughts, its branches whispering of secrets yet to be uncovered. Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking in the quiet. The game was afoot, and she was ready to play. Chapter 5. The Midnight Meeting. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cozy parlor, the soft clink of her knitting needles a steady rhythm against the quiet evening. The fire in the grate cast a warm glow over the room, illuminating the faded floral wallpaper, and the well-worn armchair where she perched, her mind as sharp as the needles in her hands. The events of the past few days had stirred her curiosity, and though the village of St. Mary Mead buzzed with admiration for the charming Mr. Victor Langston, Miss Marple's instincts told her otherwise. The torn scrap of paper she'd found near Ashfield Manor's garden gate, with its cryptic note, "Meet at midnight." Old oak lay on the small table beside her, its edges curling slightly in the warmth of the room. She had no intention of letting such a clue slip by unnoticed. The old oak tree, a gnarled giant at the edge of the manor's grounds, was a familiar landmark to the villagers. Children played beneath its sprawling branches, and lovers had been known to carve their initials into its bark. But a midnight meeting that was far from the innocent dalliances of youth. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to a long-ago incident in St. Mary Mead, when a young man, posing as a traveling salesman, had arranged clandestine meetings under the cover of darkness to swindle the local grocer. The memory sharpened her resolve. She needed eyes at that oak tree tonight, and she knew just the person to help. Lily, her young maid, was a bright, eager girl with a streak of curiosity that Miss Marple found both endearing and useful. At 19, Lily was quick on her feet and had a knack for blending into the background, a trait honed by years of navigating the village's gossip-laden social circles. Miss Marple called her into the parlor, setting her knitting aside with a gentle smile. "Lily, my dear," she began, her voice soft but firm, "I have a small task for you, if you're willing. It requires discretion and a good deal of courage." Lily's eyes widened, her cheeks flushing with excitement. "Oh, Miss Marple, you know I'm always ready to help. Is it about that Mr. Langston? Everyone's talking about him, but I heard Mrs. Bantry say you think he's not what he seems." Miss Marple chuckled softly, neither confirming nor denying the rumor. "Let's just say I'm curious about certain goings-on at Ashfield Manor. There's to be a meeting tonight, near the old oak tree, at midnight. I'd like you to keep watch, from a safe distance, mind you. Don't let yourself be seen, but listen carefully. Any conversation you overhear could be most illuminating." Lily nodded, her expression a mix of determination and nerves. "I can do that, Miss Marple. I'll be as quiet as a mouse. What should I look for?" "Anything out of the ordinary," Miss Marple replied, her eyes gleaming with quiet intensity. "Who's there, what they say, and where they go afterward. But you mustn't take risks, Lily. If anything seems dangerous, you come straight back." With the plan set, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her mind already piecing together the possibilities. The note suggested secrecy and Langston's frequent trips to London, as mentioned by the postmistress, hinted at connections beyond St. Mary Mead. Could he be involved in something as mundane as a village intrigue, or was there a larger scheme at play? Her thoughts circled back to the sapphire brooch stolen at the charity gala, and the way Langston had so deftly shifted blame to a servant. It was all too convenient, too polished, like the man himself. As the evening wore on, Lily prepared for her task. She donned a dark shawl and sturdy boots, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and excitement. Miss Marple watched her go, offering a final word of caution. "Mind the shadows, Lily, and don't linger longer than necessary." The night was cool and clear, the sky a tapestry of stars above St. Mary Mead. Lily made her way to the manor's grounds, keeping to the hedgerows to avoid prying eyes. The old oak loomed ahead, its silhouette stark against the moonlit sky. She settled behind a thicket, her breath shallow as she strained to hear any sound. The village was quiet, save for the occasional hoot of an owl and the rustle of leaves. In the gentle breeze, minutes ticked by, each one stretching longer than the last. Lily's nerves began to fray, but she held her ground, remembering Miss Marple's trust in her. At last, just as the church clock struck midnight, she heard the crunch of footsteps on the gravel path. Two figures emerged from the darkness, one tall and broad-shouldered, unmistakably Mr. Langston, his polished demeanor replaced by a tense, guarded posture. The other was shorter, cloaked in a heavy coat, their face obscured by a hat pulled low. Lily pressed herself closer to the ground, her ears straining to catch their words. Langston's voice was low, urgent. "The shipment's ready, but we need to move quickly. The old bat's been sniffing around, asking questions." The shadowy figure grunted, their voice rough and unfamiliar. "You said this village was easy pickings. If she's on to you, we're in trouble. The boss won't like delays." "She's just a nosy spinster," Langston snapped, though his tone betrayed a flicker of unease. "I'll handle her. The next shipment goes out tomorrow night, as planned. The boat's waiting at Brighthaven." Lily's heart raced. A shipment, a boat. This was no village gossip, it sounded like something far more sinister. She held her breath, willing herself to stay still as the men continued their hushed argument. "You'd better not mess this up, Langston," the stranger growled. "The jewels are one thing, but the money from that widow's another. You promised a big haul, and you'll get it," Langston replied, his voice regaining its smooth confidence. "Mrs. Henshaw's eating out of my hand. Another week, and I'll have her signing over half her fortune." The stranger laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You're a cold one, Victor. Just make sure the goods are on that boat. We're not in the charity business." Their voices faded as they moved away from the oak, heading toward the manor's back gate. Lily waited, her limbs stiffed from crouching, until she was certain they were gone. Then, as silently as she could, she slipped back through the hedgerows and hurried to Miss Marple's cottage. Miss Marple was waiting, her knitting untouched since Lily's departure. The girl burst through the door, her face flushed with excitement and fear. "Oh, Miss Marple, I heard them. Mr. Langston and some man talking about a shipment and a boat in Brighthaven, and jewels, and Mrs. Henshaw's money." Miss listened intently as Lily recounted every detail, her mind already weaving the fragments into a pattern. "Well done, Lily," she said at last, her voice calm but laced with satisfaction. "You've been very brave. Now, tell me everything. Again, slowly, and don't leave out a single word." Lily repeated the conversation, her words tumbling over each other as she described Langston's unease and the stranger's rough tone. Miss Marple nodded, her fingers resuming their rhythmic dance with the knitting needles. The mention of a boat in Brighthaven was particularly telling. She recalled a case years ago when a smuggler had used the coastal town's quiet docks to move stolen goods. Could Langston be part of a similar operation? The stolen sapphire brooch, Mrs. Henshaw's loan, and now this talk of shipments, it all pointed to a scheme far larger than St. Mary Mead's usual intrigues. "You mustn't breathe a word of this to anyone, Lily," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle but firm. "Not even to your mother or your friends at the tea shop. We don't want to tip our hand just yet." Lily nodded, her eyes wide. "I won't, Miss Marple. But what does it mean? Is Mr. Langston a criminal?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, her mind racing. "Let's just say he's not the gentleman he appears to be. But we need more than whispers in the dark to be certain. Tomorrow I'll have a word with someone who might shed light on Mr. Langston's activities." The next morning, Miss Marple rose early, her thoughts already turning to her next move. She penned a brief letter to Sir Henry Clithering, her old friend from Scotland Yard, asking for any information on smuggling operations along the coast. Sir Henry, now retired but still well-connected, had a knack for ferreting out details others overlooked. If Langston was indeed involved in a smuggling ring, Sir Henry's contacts might confirm. As she sealed the letter, Miss Marple reflected on the village's reaction to Langston. The tea shop was abuzz with praise for his charm and generosity. Yet she couldn't shake the memory of a young curate who had once charmed St. Mary Mead into trusting him, only to vanish with the church's collection plate. Human nature, she mused, was as predictable as the stitches in her knitting, lovely on the surface, but prone to tangling if you didn't watch closely. The day passed quietly, with Miss Marple tending to her garden and exchanging pleasantries with neighbors, but her mind was far from idle. She considered the footprint she'd found near the manor's garden gate too refined for a gardener's boot, too deliberate for a casual visitor. It suggested someone who moved with purpose, perhaps someone accustomed to slipping in and out unnoticed. Langston's polished shoes came to mind, and she resolved to take another look at the manor's grounds when the opportunity arose. That afternoon, she visited Dolly Bantry, her closest friend in the village. Over tea and scones, Miss Marple steered the conversation toward the charity gala and the stolen brooch. Dolly, ever eager for gossip, recounted the village's theories, most of which pinned the theft on a clumsy servant or an outsider. "But you don't think it was a servant, do you, Jane?" Dolly asked, her eyes twinkling with curiosity. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression serene. "I think, Dolly, that things are rarely as simple as they seem. People like to believe in accidents or strangers, but trouble often comes from those we least suspect." Dolly laughed, shaking her head. "You and your mysteries, Jane. I swear, you see more in a glance than most of us do in a lifetime." Miss Marple smiled, saying nothing. She had learned long ago that silence was often the best way to gather information. People filled the gaps with their own words, revealing more than they intended. By the time she left Dolly's, she had a clearer picture of the village's mood admiration for Langston, tinged with unease over the theft. It was a delicate balance, one she could use to her advantage. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple reviewed the facts. The note, the footprint, Lily's overheard conversation all pointed to Langston's involvement in something illicit. The mention of a boat in Brighthaven suggested smuggling, and the reference to jewels tied neatly to the stolen brooch, Mrs. Henshaw's loan, was another piece of the puzzle, a classic tactic of a confidence man. But Langston was no amateur. His charm and quick deflections spoke of experience. To catch him, she would need to be cleverer still. As evening fell, Miss Marple sat by her window, watching the lights of Ashfield Manor flicker in the distance. She thought of the old oak, its branches heavy with secrets, and the men who had met beneath it. The stranger's rough voice and Langston's unease suggested a partnership under strain, perhaps one ripe for betrayal. If she could find a way to exploit that tension, she might unravel Langston's scheme before he slipped away. The next day brought a reply from Sir Henry, his letter arriving with the Morning Post. He wrote of rumors circling London's underworld, a smuggling ring operating along the southern coast, dealing in stolen jewels and artifacts. The leader was said to be a charismatic figure, charming his way into high society to identify targets. Sir Henry had no name, but the description fit Langston like a glove. He promised to make discreet inquiries and urged Miss Marple to be cautious. "Cautious," Miss Marple murmured, folding the letter, "as if I'd be anything else." But she felt a thrill of anticipation. The pieces were falling into place, and she was determined to see the puzzle through. Over the next few days, Miss Marple kept a close eye on Ashfield Manor, noting Langston's comings and goings. He was as charming as ever, hosting tea parties and charming the village's matrons, but she noticed a new urgency in his manner, a flicker of impatience when he thought no one was watching. The shipment, she suspected, was his priority, and Brighthaven was the key. She enlisted Lily's help again, asking her to keep an ear out at the tea shop for any mention of Langston's plans. The girl returned with a tidbit. Seen at the train station, booking a ticket to Brighthaven for the following evening. It was the confirmation Miss Marple needed. If Langston was moving his operation to the coast, she would need to act quickly. That night, she sat down with a fresh skein of wool, her knitting a soothing counterpoint to her racing thoughts. The shipment, the boat, the jewels, it all pointed to a carefully orchestrated plan. But Langston's confidence worried her. A man so sure of himself was likely to have contingencies, perhaps even allies in St. Mary Mead. She would need to tread carefully, lest she tip her hand too soon as she worked her needles. Miss Marple considered her next move. She could confront Langston directly, but that risked alerting him. Instead, she decided to plant a seed of doubt, a tactic she'd used to great effect in the past. The village's gossip network was a powerful tool, and she knew just how to wield it. A casual remark to the postmistress, a hint dropped at the tea shop by morning. The village would be buzzing with rumors of a rare diamond hidden in Ashfield Manor's library. If Langston took the bait, he might reveal more of his plans. The plan was set, but Miss Marple knew the risks. Langston was no village swindler. He was clever, calculating, and dangerous. Yet she felt a quiet confidence, born of years spent unraveling human nature's tangled threads. Like her knitting, the truth would emerge, stitch by stitch, until the pattern was clear as she prepared for bed. Miss Marple glanced at the scrap of paper on her table, its cryptic message, a reminder of the task ahead. The midnight meeting had given her a glimpse of Langston's world, but there was more to uncover. With Lily's courage, Sir Henry's resources, and her own sharp mind, she would follow the trail to Brighthaven and beyond, determined to outwit the scoundrel who thought he could outsmart St. Mary Mead. The clock struck 10, and Miss Marple extinguished her lamp, her thoughts already on the days ahead. The game was afoot, and she was ready to play her part. Chapter 6. Mrs. Henshaw's plight. The sun dipped low over St. Mary Mead, casting a warm golden glow across the tidy gardens and thatched roofs of the village. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cozy parlor, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically. As she worked on a soft pink shawl, the familiar routine soothed her, but her mind was far from idle. The events of the past few days, Mr. Victor Langston's arrival, the charity gala, the missing sapphire brooch, and the cryptic midnight meeting Lily had overheard hurled in her thoughts like leaves caught in an autumn breeze. She had seen enough of human nature to know that charm, like Langston's, often hid something darker. A soft knock at the door interrupted her musings. "Come in," Miss Marple called, setting her knitting aside. The door creaked open, and Mrs. Clara Henshaw stepped inside, her face a mixture of agitation and hesitation. She was a plump, kindly woman in her late 50s, with soft gray curls peeking out from beneath a modest hat. Her hands fidgeted with the strap of her handbag, betraying her unease. "Oh, Miss Marple," Mrs. Henshaw began, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm so sorry to disturb you, but I simply didn't know who else to turn to. You've always been so sensible, and, well, I'm in a bit of a muddle." Miss Marple smiled warmly, gesturing to the chintz-covered armchair opposite her. "Not at all, Clara. Sit down and let's have a cup of tea. You look as though you could use one. Now, tell me what's troubling you." Mrs. Henshaw sank into the chair, her shoulders sagging as if the weight of her worries had finally found a place to rest. Miss Marple rose, moving with her characteristic quiet grace to the small table where a teapot sat, still warm from her afternoon brew. She poured 2 cups, adding a splash of milk to Mrs. Henshaw's, without asking. Years of observing her neighbors had taught her their preferences, and handed one to her guest. Mrs. Henshaw took the cup with a grateful nod, though her hands trembled as she lifted it to her lips. "It's about Mr. Langston," she said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. "You were at the gala, weren't you? Such a splendid evening, or so I thought at the time. He's so charming, so generous with his plans for the orphanage. I've done something rather foolish, I'm afraid." Miss Marple's blue eyes, sharp despite their gentle appearance, studied Mrs. Henshaw over the rim of her teacup. She said nothing, allowing the silence to encourage her visitor to continue. Silence, she had found, was often the best prompt for confidences. Mrs. Henshaw set her cup down, her fingers twisting together in her lap. "He came to see me a few days after the gala," she said. "He was so kind, so attentive. He told me about his plans to expand the orphanage project, to build a new wing for the children. He said it would be a legacy, something to honor my late husband's memory. Oh, Miss Marple, I was so flattered that he thought of me." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of quiet sympathy, though her mind was already racing. She recalled a young man in St. Mary Mead years ago, a curate with a silver tongue, who had persuaded several villagers to invest in a non-existent missionary fund. The memory was as vivid as if it had happened yesterday, and Langston's polished charm bore an unsettling resemblance. "How much did you lend him, Clara?" Miss Marple asked gently, her tone free of judgment. Mrs. Henshaw's cheeks flushed, and she looked down at her hands. £5,000, she murmured. "It was nearly all of my savings, what Mr. Henshaw left me," Mr. Langston promised. "It would be invested in a shipping venture, something to do with importing supplies for the orphanage. He said it would double in a year, perhaps even sooner. It seemed such a noble cause, and he was so convincing." Her voice trailed off, and she dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Miss Marple leaned forward, patting her hand reassuringly. There, Clara, you've done nothing wrong in wanting to help others. But tell me, did Mr. Langston give you any papers, any proof of this investment?" Mrs. Henshaw shook her head, her eyes wide with sudden realization. "No, nothing. He said it was all in hand, that the paperwork would come later. He was so busy with the gala, you see, and I didn't want to press him. Oh, Miss Marple, have I been a complete fool?" Miss Marple's lips pressed into a thin line, though her expression remained kind. "Not a fool, my dear, trusting, perhaps, but that's no crime. Men like Mr. Langston, if he is what I suspect, have a way of making their schemes sound irresistible. Now, let's not jump to conclusions. Tell me everything you remember about your conversations with him. Mrs. Henshaw took a shaky breath and recounted her meetings with Langston. He had visited her modest home on the edge of the village twice, each time bringing flowers and speaking eloquently about the orphanage. He had described the children's plight in vivid detail, painting pictures of cold, hungry orphans who would benefit from her generosity. He had even mentioned a specific ship, the Star of Albion, which he claimed would carry supplies from London to the coast. The investment, he assured her, was a sure thing, backed by his own funds and those of other wealthy patrons. Miss Marple listened intently, her knitting needles lying still in her lap. The details were troubling, not least because they echoed the tactics of the curate from her youth. That man had also spoken of ships and noble causes, only to vanish with the villagers' money. She made a mental note to ask Sir Henry Clithering about the Star of Albion when she saw him next. If Langston was involved in something as nefarious as smuggling, as the midnight meeting suggested, the ship might be more than a figment of his imagination. "Clara," Miss Marple said at last, her voice firm but gentle, "I think it would be wise to keep this between us for now. Don't mention it to Mr. Langston or anyone else, not even your closest friends. We wouldn't want to alarm him, would we? I'll make a few discreet inquiries, and we'll see what can be done." Mrs. Henshaw nodded, her relief palpable. "Oh, thank you, Miss Marple. I knew you'd know what to do. I feel so silly, but you've given me hope. Do you think there's a chance I'll get my money back?" "There's always a chance," Miss Marple said with a small smile, though she kept her true thoughts to herself. She had seen too many swindlers escape with their ill-gotten gains to make promises she couldn't keep. "Now, finish your tea, and let's talk of something more cheerful. Have you seen Mrs. Bantry's new roses? They're quite the talk of the village." Mrs. Henshaw managed a weak smile, and the conversation turned to lighter topics. But as Miss Marple chatted about roses and village gossip, her mind was elsewhere. Langston's charm, the missing brooch, the cryptic note, the midnight meeting, all pointed to a man who was more than he seemed. The question was, how deep did his deception run, and how many others in St. Mary Mead had fallen under his spell? The following morning, Miss Marple rose early, her thoughts still occupied by Mrs. Henshaw's plight. She donned her sensible tweed coat and straw hat, picked up her umbrella more for habit than necessity, as the sky was clear, and set out for a walk. Her destination was the village post office, a hub of gossip and information where she might glean more about Langston's activities. The post office was a small, bustling place, its counter presided over by Miss Weatherby, a sharp-eyed woman with a knack for remembering every letter and parcel that passed through her hands. Miss Marple greeted her with a smile and purchased a few stamps, casually steering the conversation toward recent visitors to the village. "Mr. Langston seems to have made quite an impression," Miss Marple remarked, tucking the stamps into her handbag. "I hear he's been receiving a great deal of post at Ashfield Manor. Business matters, I suppose." Miss Weatherby's eyes gleamed with the delight of sharing news. "Oh yes, Miss Marple. He gets letters nearly every day, some from London, some from goodness knows where, and parcels, 2 big ones, mind you. I said to Mrs. Baker just yesterday, it's a wonder he has time for all his charity work with so much correspondence." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Indeed, it must be quite a responsibility, managing all those affairs. I suppose he sends a good deal of post as well. Oh, he does, Miss Weatherby said, leaning forward conspiratorially. Always popping in to send telegrams or letters, and always in such a hurry. Why, just yesterday he sent a telegram to London something about a meeting, I think. I couldn't help but overhear when he was dictating it to me. Miss Marple's interest piqued, though she kept her tone light. A meeting, you say? Well, I suppose a man like Mr. Langston has many important connections. Miss Weatherby nodded eagerly. That's what I said to Mrs. Baker. He's ever so grand, isn't he? Though I must say, he's not as friendly as he was at first. A bit sharp with me the other day when I asked if he needed more stamps. I thought, well, perhaps he's just busy. Miss Marple thanked Miss Weatherby and left the post office, her mind buzzing. Telegrams to London, frequent parcels. A meeting. Langston was clearly involved in something beyond the charity he professed. The footprint near the garden gate, the cryptic note, and now this. It was all beginning to form a pattern, one that reminded her of a case in St. Mary Mead years ago, when a charming young man had used the post office to coordinate a series of thefts. She decided to pay a visit to Dolly Bantry, second only to Miss Marple's own. Dolly lived at Gossington Hall, a sprawling manor that contrasted sharply with Miss Marple's modest cottage. As Miss Marple walked along the lane, she passed Ashfield Manor, its tall chimneys just visible above the trees. She paused, her eyes scanning the grounds. The garden gate, where she had found the footprint, was closed, but she noted a faint gleam of metal near the latch, disturbed the surrounding earth, and picked up the key with her handkerchief. It was small, likely for a lockbox or a desk drawer rather than a door. She tucked it into her handbag, her mind racing with possibilities. Had Langston dropped it in his haste, or had someone else left it there? Perhaps the shadowy figure from the midnight meeting at Gossington Hall. Dolly Bantry greeted her with characteristic enthusiasm. Jane, how lovely to see you. Come in, come in. I was just about to have Have you heard the latest about that dreadful brooch business? Everyone's talking about it. Miss Marple smiled, settling into a cushioned chair in Dolly's airy drawing room. I have, Dolly, and I'm afraid it's not the only thing troubling me. Tell me, what have you heard about Mr. Langston lately? Dolly's eyes widened, and she leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Well, Jane, you didn't hear it from me. But Mrs. Price was saying at the Women's Institute that Langston's been seen driving to the station at all hours, and not just for the London trains. Sometimes he's gone in the middle of the night. Mrs. Price's nephew, who works at the station, says he's seen Langston with a man in a dark coat, very shifty looking. What do you make of that? Miss Marple's fingers itched for her knitting, a habit that helped her think, but she kept her hands still. It's curious, isn't it? A man of Mr. Langston's standing, keeping such odd hours, and with the brooch missing, one can't help but wonder. Dolly gasped. You don't think he took it, do you? Oh, Jane, he's so charming. But then, I suppose charm can hide all sorts of things. Remember that awful man who sold fake war bonds during the war? So polite, and yet— Exactly, Miss Marple said, her voice soft but firm. Charm is a tool, Dolly, and like any tool, it can be used for good or ill. Dolly nodded, her enthusiasm for gossip. You're right, Jane, you always are. But what can we do? We can't just accuse him without proof. No, we can't, Miss Marple agreed. But we can watch and listen. People reveal themselves in time, Dolly. They always do. The conversation turned to other matters, Dolly's roses, the upcoming church fete, but Miss Marple's thoughts remained with Langston. The key in her handbag, the footprint, the telegrams, the midnight meeting, it all pointed to a man who was playing a dangerous game. And Mrs. Henshaw, with her generous heart and depleted savings, was caught in the middle that afternoon. Miss Marple returned to her cottage and sat at her writing desk, pulling out a small notebook where she kept her observations. She jotted down everything she had learned: the £5,000, the Star of Albion, the parcels, the telegrams, the key. She also noted Mrs. Henshaw's description of Langston's visits, his flattery, his promises of quick returns. It was a pattern she had seen before, not just in the curate, but in other men who preyed on trust and kindness. She decided to take a calculated risk. If Langston was as cunning as she suspected, he would be cautious, but he might also be greedy. Greed, Miss Marple knew, was often the downfall of men like him. She needed to test him, to see how he would react to temptation. The idea of planting a rumor about a hidden diamond in Ashfield Manor's library was beginning to take shape, though she would need to tread carefully to avoid arousing his suspicion too soon. She telephoned her nephew, Raymond West, who was staying in London for the season. Raymond, a writer with a tendency to dismiss his aunt's insights as village gossip, was nonetheless fond of her and willing to help when pressed. "Raymond, dear," she said, when he answered, "I wonder if you could do me a small favor. Could you ask around in London about a ship called the Star of Albion? It's probably nothing, but I'm curious about its business. Aunt Jane, are you sleuthing again? What's this about a ship? Don't tell me you're chasing pirates now." Miss Marple chuckled. "Nothing so dramatic, dear. Just a little curiosity. Will you do it?" "Of course," Raymond said. "I'll ask a few friends at the docks. But honestly, Aunt Jane, you should write a novel with all these mysteries you uncover." "Perhaps one day," Miss Marple said, her tone light but her mind focused. "Thank you, Raymond." As she hung up, she felt a quiet satisfaction. The pieces were falling into place, slowly but surely. Langston's charm had fooled many in St. Mary Mead, but Miss Marple was not so easily swayed. She thought of Mrs. Henshaw, her savings gone, her trust betrayed, and felt a surge of determination. She would not let Langston slip away, not if she could help it. The days that followed were a flurry of quiet activity. Miss Marple continued her walks through the village, stopping to chat with neighbors, always steering the conversation toward Langston. She learned that he had been seen at the station again, this time with a suitcase, though he had returned to Ashfield Manor the same day. She also heard from Mrs. Price's nephew that the man in the dark coat had been seen again, this time carrying a heavy parcel. Miss Marple kept the key she had found in a small tin box on her mantelpiece, waiting for the right moment to use it. She suspected it belonged to a lockbox in Langston's study, perhaps one containing evidence of his schemes, but she would need to get inside Ashfield Manor to confirm it. Mrs. Henshaw, bringing a homemade fruitcake as an excuse to check on her. Mrs. Henshaw was still anxious, but grateful for Miss Marple's discretion. "I haven't said a word to anyone," she assured Miss Marple. "But I saw Mr. Langston yesterday, and he was so kind, asking after my health. It's hard to believe he could be dishonest." Miss Marple smiled, though her heart sank at the woman's lingering trust in Langston. "Keep faith, Clara. she said. "We'll sort this out." Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting in her lap, and thought about her next move. The rumor about the diamond would need to be planted carefully, perhaps through Dolly Bantry, who could spread it without suspicion. If Langston took the bait, it might lead him to reveal more of his plans. And if he was involved in smuggling, as she suspected, the key and the Star of Albion might hold the answers. The village clock chimed midnight, and Miss Marple set her knitting aside. She felt a familiar thrill, the same she always felt when a mystery began to unravel. Langston was clever, but she had faced clever men before, and like the patterns in her knitting, their secrets always came to light in the end. Chapter 7. A visit to London. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly in her cozy cottage in St. Mary Mead, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on a soft woolen shawl. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak table before her. Her mind, however, was far from the tranquil domestic scene. The events of the past few days, the theft of the sapphire brooch, the cryptic note, the midnight meeting at the old oak had woven a tapestry of suspicion in her sharp, observant mind. Victor Langston, the charming newcomer to Ashfield Manor, was at the heart of it, and Miss Marple was determined to unravel the truth. She set her knitting aside and rose, smoothing her skirt with a purposeful air. The village gossip, though often exaggerated, had provided enough threads for her to begin stitching together a pattern. His polished manners and quick deflections reminded her of a deceitful curate she had encountered in her youth, a man who had used his charm to swindle half the parish before being caught. If Langston was involved in something as nefarious as smuggling, as she now suspected, London was the place to find answers. Miss Marple packed a small valise with essentials, a spare cardigan, her best hat, and a notebook for jotting down observations. She telephoned her nephew, Raymond West, to inform him of her plans, though she kept her true intentions vague. Raymond, a writer with a penchant for dismissing his aunt's village fancies, would only scoff if she mentioned smuggling rings and stolen jewels. Instead, she mentioned a desire to visit an old friend and perhaps do a bit of shopping. In the city, Raymond, distracted by his latest manuscript, offered to arrange a taxi to the station, which she accepted with a polite smile. The train journey to London was uneventful, though Miss Marple found herself studying her fellow passengers with her usual keen eye. A young man in a flashy suit read a racing paper with too much intensity, while a woman in a fur stole fidgeted with her gloves, glancing nervously out the window. Neither seemed connected to Langston, but Miss Marple noted their behaviors all the same, filing them away in the vast mental catalogue she maintained of human nature. People, she often thought, were like her knitting patterns, predictable once you understood the stitches. Upon arriving at Paddington Station, Miss Marple navigated the bustling platform with surprising agility for a woman of her age. The clamor of porters, the hiss of steam, and the chatter of travelers did not faze her. She hailed a taxi and directed the driver to a modest hotel near Bloomsbury, where she had stayed on previous visits to the capital. The hotel was unassuming, its faded wallpaper and creaky floors a stark contrast to the grandeur of Ashfield Manor, but it suited Miss Marple perfectly. She preferred places where she could observe without being noticed, where the staff were too busy to pry and the guests too preoccupied with their own affairs. After settling into her room, Miss Marple placed a call to Sir Henry Clithering, her old friend and a retired Scotland Yard commissioner. Sir Henry, a man of sharp intellect and impeccable manners, had always valued Miss Marple's insights, even when others dismissed her as a meddling spinster. They arranged to meet for tea at a quiet cafe near Trafalgar Square, a place where they could speak freely without attracting attention. The cafe was a charming establishment, its tables adorned with crisp white linens and delicate china teacups. Sir Henry was already seated when Miss Marple arrived, his silver hair neatly combed and his suit as immaculate as ever. He rose to greet her, his eyes twinkling with affection. "Jane, my dear," he said, taking her hand, "you look as spry as ever. What brings you to London? Not another of your village mysteries, I hope?" Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Oh, Henry, you know me too well. I'm afraid it's precisely that, a mystery, and a rather troubling one." They ordered tea, and as the waiter set down a pot of Earl Grey and a plate of scones, Miss Marple recounted the events in St. Mary Mead. She described Langston's arrival, the stolen sapphire brooch, the cryptic note, and the overheard conversation at the old oak tree. Sir Henry listened intently, his fingers steepled as he absorbed every detail. "This Langston sounds like a slippery character," he remarked when she finished. "Charismatic, well-dressed, and quick to deflect suspicion. I've known men like that in my time, charmers, who hide their sins behind a smile." "Precisely," Miss Marple said, stirring her tea. "He reminds me of young Mr. Peterson, the curate who swindled Mrs. Eldridge out of her savings in '23. All smiles and promises, but his eyes gave him away. Langston has the same look, a little too calculated, a little too eager to please." Sir Henry nodded. "And you think his trips to London are connected to this business with the brooch?" "I do," Miss Marple replied. "I suspect he's involved in something larger, perhaps a smuggling ring. The brooch may be just one piece of a much bigger puzzle." Sir Henry leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "Smuggling, you say? My contacts at the Yard have mentioned a ring dealing in stolen jewels and artifacts, moving them through coastal towns to the continent. The leader is said to be a charismatic sort, someone who can blend into high society while orchestrating the operation from the shadows." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "That sounds very like our Mr. Langston. Do you think you could make some inquiries, Henry, discreetly, of course? I'd like to know more about his background, where he comes from, who he associates with, and whether he's been linked to any such activities." Sir Henry chuckled. "Discreet inquiries are my specialty, Jane. I'll put out some feelers." "With my old colleagues?" "Oh, goodness, no," Miss Marple said, her tone light but her eyes sharp. "I'm far too old for heroics, but I do intend to keep an eye on him. If he's planning another move, I want to be ready. The village is buzzing with gossip about him, and I've found that gossip, properly sifted, can be as valuable as any police report." They spent the rest of the afternoon discussing the case, with Sir Henry sharing stories of his days at Scotland Yard, and Miss Marple recounting village anecdotes that to an outsider might seem trivial, but to her were rich with insight. By the time they parted, Sir Henry had promised to contact his former colleagues and report back within a day or two. Miss Marple, meanwhile, decided to spend the rest of her time in London, observing the city's undercurrents, the places where men like Langston might operate. The following morning, Miss Marple set out to explore the areas Langston might frequent. She began at the British Museum. not because she suspected Langston of loitering among the antiquities, but because it was a hub for all sorts of people, tourists, scholars, and occasionally those with less savory motives. She wandered through the galleries, her eyes scanning the crowds. A man in a dark coat lingered too long near a display of Egyptian jewelry, his hands twitching nervously. Another, dressed in a tailored suit, spoke in hushed tones to a companion near the Rosetta Stone. Neither was Langston, but Miss Marple noted their behaviors, adding them to her mental catalogue. From the museum, she took a bus to Covent Garden, where the bustling market offered a different kind of observation post. She sat at a small cafe, sipping tea and watching the vendors and shoppers. A group of well-dressed men caught her attention, their laughter too loud and their glances too sharp. One of them, a tall man with a pencil-thin mustache, bore a passing resemblance to Langston in his mannerisms, confident, almost theatrical. Miss Marple made a mental note to ask Sir Henry if Langston had any known associates in London. As the day wore on, Miss Marple visited several other locations, a jeweler's shop in Hatton Garden, where she inquired about recent thefts discreetly, of course, posing as a curious elderly lady, and a small antique shop in Mayfair, where she overheard a conversation about a new supplier with connections to the coast. Each stop added a small piece to the puzzle, though none confirmed Langston's involvement directly. Still, Miss Marple was patient. She knew that mysteries, like her knitting, required time and care to complete. That evening, she dined alone. At her hotel, her thoughts occupied by Langston. The waiter, a young man with a nervous habit of tugging at his collar, reminded her of a village boy who had once been caught stealing apples. She tipped him generously, earning a grateful smile, and made a note to ask about the hotel's other guests. Langston, she suspected, would not stay in a place as modest as this, but he might have contacts who did. The next morning, Sir Henry telephoned with news. "Jane, you've got a nose for trouble," he said, his voice tinged with amusement. "I spoke to Inspector Davies. At the Yard, there's no record of a Victor Langston, but the description you gave matches a man known as Vincent Lyle, who's been on their radar for months. He's suspected of running a smuggling operation, jewels, mostly, but some antiquities as well. No hard evidence, mind you, but he's been seen in the company of some unsavory types in Brighthaven and Dover." "Brighthaven," Miss Marple repeated, her mind racing. "That's a coastal town, isn't it? Perfect for smuggling." "Exactly," Sir Henry said. "Davies is putting together a file on Langston. If it's the same man, I'll have it sent to your hotel by tomorrow. In the meantime, Jane, be careful. If this man is who we think he is, he's dangerous." Miss Marple thanked him and hung up, her thoughts already turning to her next move. Brighthaven. The name conjured images of foggy docks and shadowy figures, the kind of place where a man like Langston could operate unnoticed. She would need to return to St. Mary Mead soon, before Langston grew suspicious of her absence. But first, she wanted to see the file Sir Henry had promised. The file arrived the following morning, delivered by a young constable who looked barely old enough to shave. Miss Marple tipped him and settled into her room to read. The file was thin, as Sir Henry had warned, but it contained enough to confirm her suspicions. Vincent Lyle, alias Victor Langston, was a man of many faces, articulate and utterly ruthless. He had no convictions, but his name had surfaced in connection with several thefts and smuggling cases, always slipping through the authorities' fingers. The file included a photograph, grainy but unmistakable. It was Langston, his smile as polished as ever. Miss Marple closed the file and sat back, her knitting needles resuming their steady rhythm. The pieces were falling into place, but she needed more evidence, something concrete to tie Langston to the sapphire brooch and Mrs. Henshaw's money. She decided to return to St. Mary Mead the next day, armed with this new information. Langston, she suspected, would make his next move soon, and she intended to be ready. The train back to St. Mary Mead was quieter than the journey to London, giving Miss Marple time to reflect. She thought of Mrs. Henshaw, so trusting and vulnerable, and of the villagers who had been charmed by Langston's facade. Human nature, she mused, was both predictable and surprising. Langston had played his role well, but he had underestimated the quiet spinster in the corner, the one who saw through his charm to the deceit beneath. As the train pulled into the station, Miss Marple gathered her valise and stepped onto the platform. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and chimney smoke. She felt a renewed sense of purpose. Langston might think himself clever, but Miss Marple had faced clever men before, and she always outwitted them in the end. Her cottage. She unpacked her things and resumed her knitting, the familiar rhythm soothing her thoughts. She would need to act quickly, but carefully. Langston was no fool, and he would not stay in St. Mary Mead much longer if he sensed danger. She decided to plant a trap, something to draw him out and expose his true nature. The idea came to her as she worked on a particularly intricate stitcher rumor, carefully spread through the village gossip network, about a rare diamond hidden in Ashfield Manor's library. If Langston took the bait, she would have him. Miss Marple smiled to herself, her needles clicking softly in the quiet cottage. The game was afoot, and she was ready to play her part. Chapter 8. The trap is set. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cozy drawing-room in St. Mary Mead, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she pondered her next move. The village was abuzz with the latest gossip about Mr. Victor Langston, the charming newcomer who had taken up residence at Ashfield Manor. His polished manners and generous charity Gala had won over many, but Miss Marple's sharp instincts told her there was more to him than met the eye. The disappearance of the sapphire brooch at the Gala, coupled with the cryptic note she'd found in the garden and the overheard conversation at the Old Oak, pointed to a scheme far grander than mere theft. Langston was no ordinary scoundrel, and Miss Marple was determined to catch him in the act. Her plan was simple yet daring. Plant a rumor to lure Langston into revealing his true intentions. She knew that a man like him, driven by greed and cunning, would not resist the temptation of a valuable prize. The idea had come to her while sipping tea with Dolly Bantry, who, in her usual effusive manner, had been recounting the village's fascination with Langston's wealth. Miss Marple had casually mentioned, within earshot of Mrs. Price, the village's most prolific gossip, that a rare diamond rumored to be part of an old estate had been hidden in Ashfield Manor's library during renovations years ago. The story was entirely fabricated, but Miss Marple knew it would spread like wildfire through St. Mary Mead's tea shops and parlors by the next morning. The rumor had taken root. At the local post office, Miss Marple overheard Mrs. Price whispering to Mrs. Weatherby about the hidden diamond, her eyes gleaming with excitement. Miss Marple smiled to herself, her knitting needles never pausing. The bait was set, and now she needed to ensure she could catch Langston when he took it. The help of her young maid, Lily, a bright and observant girl who had proven her loyalty during the midnight watch at the old oak tree. "Lily," Miss Marple said, setting her knitting aside and looking at the girl with a twinkle in her eye, "I have a task for you, but it requires the utmost discretion. You mustn't breathe a word of it to anyone, not even your mother." Lily's eyes widened, but she nodded eagerly. "Of course, Miss Marple. I'd do anything to help you." Miss Marple explained her plan. Lily was to keep watch near Ashfield Manor's library window after dusk, hidden in the shrubbery where she could observe without being seen. If Langston took the bait and searched for the non-existent diamond, Lily would report back immediately. Miss Marple would be nearby, ready to act on the evidence. She gave Lily a small notebook to jot down anything she saw or heard, emphasizing the importance of precision. "Details, my dear," she said, "are the threads that weave the truth together." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple positioned herself in the garden of her cottage, which offered a clear view of the path leading to Ashfield Manor. She wore a dark shawl to blend into the twilight and carried her knitting bag, though it contained more than just wool and needles tonight. Inside was a small flashlight, a notepad, and a whistle to signal for help if needed. She had also informed her nephew, Raymond West, of her suspicions, though he had laughed them off as Aunt Jane's fanciful notions. Still, she had persuaded him to be on standby in case things took an unexpected turn. Lily, meanwhile, had taken her post behind a thick rhododendron bush near the manor's library window. The leaves and the village was quiet, save for the occasional hoot of an owl. Lily clutched the notebook tightly, her heart pounding with a mix of excitement and fear. She had always admired Miss Marple's quiet wisdom, and the thought of helping her unravel a mystery made her feel like a character in one of Raymond West's detective novels. At 9:30, Lily saw movement. A figure approached the manor's side entrance, moving with the cautious grace of someone who didn't want to be noticed. The light from a nearby lantern caught the figure's face briefly, and Lily's breath caught it was Mr. Langston. He glanced around, his eyes scanning the darkened grounds, before slipping a key into the lock and entering the manor. Lily scribbled a quick note in her book. 9:32 p.m. Mr. L. entered side door, library side. Inside Ashfield Manor, Langston moved swiftly through the dimly lit corridors. The library was at the far end of the house, a grand room lined with oak shelves and heavy leather-bound volumes. He had heard the rumor about the diamond from Mrs. Weatherby, who had mentioned it in passing during a visit to the manor earlier that day. The idea of a hidden gem, overlooked for years, was too tantalizing to ignore. Langston's mind raced with possibilities. Such a find could fund his next venture or serve as leverage in his smuggling dealings. He didn't believe the story entirely, but he couldn't risk ignoring it, especially with his plans to leave St. Mary Mead soon. The library was dark when he entered, save for the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the tall windows. Langston lit a small pocket torch, its beam cutting through the shadows as he scanned the room. The rumor hadn't specified where the diamond was hidden, so he began with the shelves, pulling out books and tapping the panels behind them for hollow spaces. He worked methodically, his movements betraying a familiarity with such searches. Every so often, He paused to listen for footsteps or voices, but the manor remained silent. Outside, Lily watched through the window, her eyes straining to follow Langston's movements. She saw him lift a candlestick from a side table, examine its base, and then replace it with a muttered curse. She wrote, 9:48 p.m. Mr. L. Searching shelves, checked candlestick. Her hands trembled slightly, but she forced herself to stay calm, knowing Miss Marple was counting on her. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had crept closer to the manor, keeping to the shadows of the garden wall. She could see the faint glow of Langston's torch through the library window and nodded to herself. The trap was working. Of confronting Langston directly, such heroics were for younger, more reckless souls, but she needed evidence to confirm her suspicions. If Langston was searching for the diamond, it proved he was driven by greed, and greed, as Miss Marple knew, often led to mistakes. As the clock neared 10, Langston's search grew more frantic. He overturned cushions, peered behind paintings, and even pried at the floorboards near the fireplace. The library was a treasure trove of potential hiding places, but the diamond remained elusive. His frustration was palpable, and he muttered to himself, "It's got to be here somewhere. They wouldn't lie about something like this." Still hidden in the shrubbery, caught a glimpse of Langston's face as he passed the window. His usual charm was gone, replaced by a hard, calculating expression that sent a shiver down her spine. She wrote, 10:02 p.m. Mr. L. looks angry, checking floorboards. She hesitated, wondering if she should fetch Miss Marple, but decided to stay put, knowing her role was to observe. Miss Marple, however, had already decided to take a closer look. She moved silently along the garden path, her steps light despite her age. She reached a spot where she could peer through a gap in the curtains, her eyes narrowing as she watched Langston's desperate search. It was then that she noticed something odd, a small brass key glinting on the floor near the desk. Langston hadn't seen it, too focused on the shelves, but Miss Marple's keen eye missed nothing. She made a mental note to investigate the key later, suspecting it might belong to a safe or hidden compartment. Suddenly, a noise from the hallway made Langston freeze. He doused his torch and pressed himself against the wall, listening intently. It was only the creak of the old house settling, but it was enough to spook him. The library too long, and the risk of being caught was growing. With a final glance around the room, he slipped out through the side door, locking it behind him. Lily saw him leave and scribbled, 10:15 p.m. Mr. L. left library, looked nervous. She waited a few moments to ensure he was gone before darting back to Miss Marple's cottage, her heart racing. She found Miss Marple already there, calmly knitting by the fire as if she hadn't just been skulking around Ashfield Manor. Miss Marple, Lily gasped, clutching her notebook. He was there, just like you said, pulling books off the shelves and everything. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling with satisfaction. Well done, Lily. Tell me everything you saw, and don't leave out a single detail. Lily recounted her observations, reading from her notebook to ensure accuracy. Miss Marple listened intently, her fingers never pausing in their knitting. When Lily mentioned Langston's frustrated, muttering, and nervous exit, Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. He's on edge, she said. That's good. A man on edge makes mistakes. But what about the diamond? Lily asked. There isn't really one, is there? No, my dear, Miss Marple said, her voice soft but firm. The diamond was a fiction, but his reaction to it tells us everything we need to know. He's greedy, and he's hiding something. Now we must be patient and let him make his next move." Miss Marple decided to let Langston slip away for now. Confronting him in the library would have been premature, and she needed more than just his search for a non-existent diamond to prove his guilt. The key she'd seen on the floor intrigued, might lead to the sapphire brooch or other stolen goods. She resolved to return to the manor the next day under the pretense. Langston's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Oh, it's a fine collection," he said smoothly. "But I'm afraid I haven't had much time to read. Too busy with the charity work, you know." "Of course," Miss Marple said, sipping her tea, "though I imagine there are all sorts of treasures hidden in a place like this. Old houses are full of surprises." Mrs. Henshaw laughed, oblivious to the undercurrent in the conversation. "Oh, Jane, you and your imagination. Next, you'll be saying there's a secret passage or a hidden fortune." Langston chuckled, but his eyes were wary. Miss Marple changed the subject, chatting about village matters, but her mind was on the library. When Mrs. Henshaw excused herself to speak with the housekeeper, Miss Marple seized her chance. "Mr. Langston," she said, "might I have a quick look at the library? I'm searching for a particular volume on gardening, and I hear you have quite the collection." Langston hesitated, then nodded, unable to refuse without arousing suspicion. "Of course, Miss Marple. It's just down the hall. I'll show you." He led her to the library, and Miss Marple made a show of browsing the shelves, her eyes darting to the floor near the desk. The key was still there, half hidden under a rug. She waited until Langston was distracted by a question about a book, then stooped to adjust her shoe, deftly slipping the key into her knitting bag. Her heart beat a little faster, but her expression remained serene. "Thank you, Mr. Langston," she said, selecting a random book from the shelf. "This will do nicely. I shan't keep you any longer." Back at her cottage, Miss Marple examined the key. It was small and ornate, likely for a safe or a locked drawer. She suspected it belonged to Langston's private study, a room he kept locked even when entertaining guests. She would need to find a way to access it, but that would require careful planning. For now, she tucked the key into a small box under her bed, satisfied that her trap had yielded more than just confirmation of Langston's greed. Over the next few days, Miss Marple kept a close eye on Langston's movements, relying on Lily and other village informants to report his comings and goings. The rumor about the diamond had spread further, and Langston seemed increasingly agitated, as if he sensed the net closing around him. He announced a sudden trip to London, claiming it was for charity business, but Miss Marple suspected he was meeting his smuggling contacts. She decided to consult Sir Henry Clithering again, sending him a letter with the details of her findings, including the key and the overheard conversation at the Old Oak. She asked him to look into any safes or lockboxes that might match the key, hoping it would lead to the stolen sapphire brooch or other evidence of Langston's crimes. Sir Henry, ever impressed by Miss Marple's intuition, promised to investigate. Immediately, as the days passed, Miss Marple continued her routine, knitting by the fire and chatting with neighbors, all the while piecing together the puzzle of Victor Langston. She knew he was planning to leave St. Mary Mead soon, and she couldn't let him slip away with Mrs. Henshaw's money or the stolen jewels. The trap had been set, and now it was a matter of timing. She would follow him with Inspector Craddock's help to wherever his next move led whether it was London, the coast, or beyond, the village, unaware of the drama unfolding, carried on with its daily rhythm. Mrs. Price gossiped about the diamond. Mrs. Weatherby planned a new flower bed, and Dolly Bantry speculated about Langston's sudden departure. But Miss Marple, with her quiet determination and unerring instincts, was ready for the chase. She knew that human nature, like the patterns in her knitting, always revealed itself in time, and Victor Langston was no exception. Chapter 9. The chase begins. The morning sun barely pierced the heavy mist that clung to St. Mary Mead, casting a soft, ethereal glow over the village. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cozy parlor, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on a delicate lace shawl. The room was filled with the familiar comforts of her cottage chintz curtains, a well-worn armchair, and a small table holding a steaming teapot. Yet her mind was far from the tranquil domesticity of her surroundings. Despite her age, flickered with purpose as she mulled over the events of the past few days. Victor Langston's sudden announcement of his departure had sent ripples of surprise through the village. At the tea shop, Mrs. Price, the postmistress, had been the first to share the news, her voice tinged with disappointment. "Such a charming man," she'd said, fanning herself with a letter. "Off to London, he says, for urgent business. A pity, really. Ashfield Manor won't be the same without him." The other villagers had nodded, their faces reflecting a mix of regret and admiration for the man who had so effortlessly won their trust. But Miss Marple, sipping her tea in the corner, had felt a different stirring, certainty that Langston's departure was not a mere whim but a calculated move. She set her knitting aside and rose, smoothing her skirt. The time for quiet observation was over. Langston's abrupt exit, coming so soon after his late-night search in Ashfield Manor's library, confirmed her suspicions. He was no philanthropist, no gentleman of leisure. He was a scoundrel, and a clever one at that. But cleverness, Miss Marple knew, often tripped over its own arrogance. She had seen it before in the grocer's assistant, who'd swindled half the village with promises of rare wartime rations, in the curate whose sermons hid a penchant for pilfering church funds. Langston's polished charm was a mask, and she was determined to see it slip. Her first task was to act swiftly. She crossed the room to the telephone, an instrument she used sparingly, and dialed the number for Sir Henry Clithering's London office. The line crackled, and after a moment his familiar, steady voice answered. "Jane, my dear," Sir Henry said warmly, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" "No pleasure today, Henry," Miss Marple replied, her tone brisk but cordial. "I need your help. Our Mr. Langston is leaving St. Mary Mead this morning, and I'm certain he's fleeing to cover his tracks. I suspect he's tied to that smuggling ring you mentioned. Can you arrange for someone to keep an eye on him?" Sir Henry's voice grew serious. "You're sure of this, Jane? Langston's been careful, from what you've told me. No hard evidence yet." "Not yet," she admitted, "but I've seen his kind before. He's moving too quickly, Henry, and men like that don't run unless they're chased. If we don't act now, he'll slip through our fingers." There was a pause, and Miss Marple could almost hear Sir Henry's mind working, weighing her intuition against the practicalities of police work. Finally, he said, "Very well. I'll contact Inspector Craddock. He's in the area and can organize a discreet tale." "Where's Langston headed?" "The 10:15 train to London," Miss Marple said. He's booked a first-class ticket, according to Mrs. Price, who heard it from the station-master's wife. First class, Sir Henry chuckled. The man travels in style. All right. Jane Craddock will be at the station. But I want you to stay clear of this. Langston could be dangerous if cornered. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her fingers brushing the edge of her shawl. Oh, I'll be careful, Henry. But I may need to see this through myself. Jane, Sir Henry began, but she gently interrupted. I'll keep you informed. Thank you, Henry. She hung up before he could protest further, her mind already racing ahead. Langston would not expect pursuit so soon, but he was clever enough to cover his tracks. She needed to be there, to observe, to catch the small details that men like Inspector Craddock, capable though he was, might overlook. She rang for Lily, her young maid, who appeared promptly, her cheeks flushed from scrubbing the kitchen floor. Lily, Miss Marple said, fetch my coat and hat. I'm going to the station. Lily's eyes widened. The station, miss? Are you off to London too? Perhaps, Miss Marple said, her tone enigmatic. But first, I need to see someone off. The St. Mary Mead station was a small, tidy affair, with a single platform and a ticket office that doubled as the station master's gossip hub. By the time Miss Marple arrived, her black hat firmly pinned and her coat buttoned against the morning chill, the platform was bustling with activity. Farmers with crates of produce, a gaggle of school children, and a few villagers waiting for the London train milled about, their chatter blending with the distant whistle of the approaching locomotive. Miss Marple spotted Langston immediately. He stood near the edge of the platform, his tailored suit immaculate, a leather valise at his feet. His face was calm, but his eyes darted toward the horizon, as if willing the train to arrive sooner. She noted the way his hand rested on the valise, fingers tapping lightly, a nervous habit, perhaps, or a sign he was guarding something precious. She tucked herself behind a stack of milk churns, her small frame blending into the crowd, and watched. Moments later, Inspector Craddock appeared, his plainclothes attire doing little to disguise his authoritative bearing. He caught Miss Marple's eye and gave a subtle nod before positioning himself near the ticket office, pretending to read a timetable. Miss Marple approved of his discretion, but wished he'd chosen a less conspicuous spot. Langston, she suspected, was too sharp to miss such details. The train pulled in with a hiss of steam, and Langston boarded swiftly, taking a window seat in the first-class carriage. Miss Marple hesitated only a moment before making her decision. She approached the ticket window, purchased a second-class ticket to London. She had no intention of drawing attention by traveling in Langston's carriage and boarded the train. Just as the whistle blew, the journey to London was uneventful. But Miss Marple's mind was anything but idle. She sat by the window, her knitting in her lap, her eyes fixed on the passing countryside, while her thoughts pieced together the puzzle. Langston's valise, she was certain, held more than clothes. The smuggling ring Sir Henry had described dealt in stolen jewels, and the sapphire brooch from the Gala was likely just one piece of a larger haul. Langston's trips to London, his midnight meeting by the oak tree, his sudden departure, all pointed to a man preparing to move his spoils. Before suspicion tightened around him, at Paddington Station, the bustle of the city enveloped her. Porters shouted, taxis honked, and travelers hurried in every direction. Miss Marple lingered near the platform, her eyes scanning for Langston. He emerged from the first-class carriage, valise in hand, and strode toward the station exit. Inspector Craddock followed at a distance, his hat pulled low. Miss Marple, unnoticed, trailed behind, her steps light but purposeful. Langston hailed a taxi, and Miss Marple watched as Craddock signaled to a plainclothes officer waiting nearby. The officer, a young man with a sharp jaw and quick eyes, slipped into another taxi, instructing the driver to follow Langston's. Miss Marple, unwilling to be left behind, approached a third taxi and, with a polite smile, gave the driver the same instructions. "Keep your distance, please," she told the driver, a grizzled man with a skeptical look. "I'm visiting a friend, but I don't wish to be seen just yet." The driver grunted but complied, weaving through London's crowded streets as Langston's taxi led them south. Miss Marple sat back, her knitting needles clicking softly, her mind alert. The chase, she knew, was only beginning. Langston's taxi stopped at Victoria Station, and Miss Marple's heart quickened. Another train journey suggested he was heading somewhere specific, likely to meet his smuggling contacts. She followed him into the station, keeping to the edges of the crowd. Craddock and his officer were there too, their movements careful but not invisible. Langston purchased a ticket for a coastal train to Brighthaven, a small port town known for its fishing boats and quiet coves. Miss Marple, her suspicions confirmed, bought a ticket for the same train. The journey to Brighthaven took nearly 3 hours, the train rattling through rolling hills and past windswept cliffs. Miss Marple sat in a second-class carriage, her knitting untouched now, her attention fixed on the task ahead. Langston, she guessed, was heading to the coast to offload his stolen goods, perhaps to a ship waiting to carry them abroad. The cryptic note about the next shipment and the midnight meeting by the oak tree pointed to a well-organized operation, one that relied on Langston's charm to open doors and his cunning to close them. Brighthaven Station was a stark contrast to Paddington's chaos. The platform was nearly deserted, the air heavy with the scent of salt and fish. Langston disembarked, his valise swinging lightly, and headed toward the town center. Miss Marple followed, her small figure dwarfed by the rugged landscape. Craddock and his officer were close behind, their presence reassuring but not entirely welcome. Miss Marple preferred to work alone, relying on her own observations, but she knew the police were necessary for what lay ahead. The town of Brighthaven was a maze of narrow streets and weathered buildings, the kind of place where secrets could hide in plain sight. Langston moved with purpose, his pace quickening as he neared the docks. Miss Marple, her heart pounding despite her calm exterior, kept him in sight, noting the way he glanced over his shoulder. He was nervous now, she thought, and nervous men. Miss Marple's pulse quickened. The valise, as she'd suspected, held the stolen jewels, perhaps including the sapphire brooch. She glanced toward Craddock, who was positioned behind a fishing net, his eyes fixed on Langston. The officer was nearby, radio in hand, likely relaying their position to Sir Henry. The man in the cap led Langston toward a small boat moored at the edge of the dock. Miss Marple crept closer, her movements silent despite her age. She needed to see the boat's name, its destination, anything that would confirm her theory. The fog made it difficult, but she caught a glimpse of the boat's hull, Sea Sparrow. The name meant nothing to her, but she committed it to memory, knowing it might be the key to unraveling Langston's operation. As Langston and the man boarded the boat, Miss Marple made a bold decision. She signaled to Craddock, who hesitated before nodding. Together they approached a nearby fisherman, a grizzled man mending nets. "We need a boat," Miss Marple said firmly. "Quickly, please. It's a matter of some urgency." The fisherman looked skeptical, but pointed to a small motorboat tied to the dock. "That one's mine. £50 for the night." Craddock paid without hesitation, and Miss Marple, Craddock, and the officer climbed aboard. The fisherman started the engine, and they set off into the fog, following the faint outline of the sea sparrow. The chase was on, and Miss Marple, her knitting tucked safely in her bag, felt a surge of exhilaration. Langston thought he'd outwitted them all, but he hadn't reckoned on the quiet determination of an elderly spinster from St. Mary Mead. The sea was rough, the waves slapping against the boat's hull as they pursued the sea sparrow. Miss Marple sat near the bow, her eyes fixed on the faint light of Langston's boat. Craddock stood beside her, his face tense, while the officer relayed updates to Sir Henry via radio. The fisherman, sensing the gravity of the situation, kept the boat steady, his hands expert on the wheel. "He's heading for the island," the fisherman said, nodding toward a dark shape on the horizon. "There's a cove there, hidden from view. Smugglers used it in the old days." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. The island, she suspected, was where Langston's operation was Basta, perfect hiding place for stolen goods. She recalled the cryptic note about the old oak and wondered if it referred to a landmark on the island. Perhaps a meeting point or a cache. She would know soon enough. The sea sparrow slowed as it neared the island, its light flickering in the fog. Miss Marple's boat followed at a distance, the fisherman cutting the engine to avoid detection. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the lapping of waves and the occasional cry of a gull. Craddock leaned close, his voice a whisper. "We can't board them yet," he said. "We need to know where they're going, what they're hiding." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes never leaving the sea sparrow. "Patience, Inspector. He'll lead us to the truth." As the sea sparrow docked at a small cove, Langston and the man disembarked, carrying the valise and a heavy crate. Miss Marple's heart raced. The crate, she was certain, contained the stolen jewels, perhaps the entire haul from Langston's smuggling ring. She turned to Craddock, her voice steady. "We must follow them," she said, "but carefully. He's desperate now, and desperate men are unpredictable." Craddock nodded, and the fisherman maneuvered the boat toward the cove, keeping to the shadows. Miss Marple, her small frame bundled against the cold, felt a strange calm settle over her. The chase had begun, and she was ready to see it through to the end. The island loomed closer, its cliffs stark against the foggy sky. Langston and his accomplice disappeared into the darkness, their footsteps echoing on the rocky shore. Miss Marple, Craddock, and the officer disembarked, their movements silent but determined. The chase was far from over, but Miss Marple knew they were closing in. Langston's carefully constructed facade was crumbling, and she would be there when it fell. The cove was narrow, flanked by jagged rocks that glistened with spray. Miss Marple moved cautiously, her eyes scanning for any sign of Langston. The fog was both a blessing and a curse, hiding them from view, but making it difficult to track their quarry. Craddock took the lead, his flashlight casting a narrow beam. Across the path the officer followed, his hand on his radio, ready to call for backup if needed. They followed a faint trail that wound upward toward the heart of the island. Miss Marple's breath came in short puffs, but she kept pace, her determination outweighing her age. She thought of Mrs. Henshaw, whose trust Langston had betrayed, and of the villagers who had been charmed by his lies. She thought of the sapphire, Brooch, a symbol of his greed, and of the countless other treasures he'd stolen. She would not let him escape. The trail led to a small cave, its entrance hidden by overhanging vines. Miss Marple paused, her hand on Craddock's arm. "Listen," she whispered. From within the cave came the sound of voices, Langston's, sharp and commanding, and another gruffer, arguing in low tones. Miss Marple strained to hear, catching fragments of their conversation. "Too risky now," the gruff voice said. "They're on to us." "They're on to nothing," Langston snapped. "We move the goods tonight, and we're done. No one will find us here." Miss Marple's lips pressed into a thin line. She turned to Craddock, her voice barely audible. "We need to see what's inside, but we must be careful. He's cornered, and cornered men are dangerous." Craddock nodded, signaling to the officer. They crept closer, using the rocks for cover. Miss Marple followed, her heart pounding but her mind clear. She had faced danger before, not in dramatic chases or hidden caves, but in the quiet unraveling of human nature. This was no different, she told herself. Langston was a puzzle, and she was close to solving him. The cave's entrance was narrow, but Craddock slipped inside, his flashlight illuminating the damp walls. Miss Marple followed, her small frame making her nearly invisible in the shadows. The officer brought up the rear, his radio silent now to avoid detection. Inside, the cave opened into a larger chamber where crates were stacked against the walls. Langston stood near a wooden table, the valise open beside him, its contents glittering in the dim light jewels, dozens of them, sparkling like stars. Miss Marple's breath caught. There, among the treasures, was the sapphire brooch, its deep blue stone unmistakable. She felt a surge of satisfaction, but it was short-lived. Langston turned, his eyes narrowing as he sensed movement. He grabbed a pistol from the table, his voice sharp. "Who's there?" he called, his gaze sweeping the shadows. Miss Marple froze, her heart racing. Craddock motioned for her to stay back, his own hand on his weapon. The officer crouched, ready to move. For a moment, the cave was silent, the tension thick enough to choke on. Then Langston's accomplice, the man in the rough coat, pointed toward the entrance. "Someone's out there," he said, his voice low. "I heard something." Langston's face hardened. "Get the goods. We're leaving now." Miss Marple knew they couldn't let him escape. She whispered to Craddock, "We must act now, or he'll slip away." Craddock nodded, his jaw set. He stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Victor Langston, this is Inspector Craddock of Scotland Yard. You're under arrest. Put the weapon down." His accomplice followed, dragging the crate. Craddock cursed under his breath and gave chase. The officer, close behind Miss Marple, unable to keep up, stayed near the entrance, her mind racing. She knew Langston's type, cunning, desperate, but not infallible. She recalled a village boy, Hood, hidden from his father's wrath by climbing a tree, only to be caught when he left footprints in the mud. Langston, she suspected, would make a similar mistake. She stepped outside, her eyes scanning the rocky path. The fog was lifting slightly, revealing a faint trail leading toward the cliffs. She followed it, her steps careful but quick. She could hear shouts in the distance. Craddock and the officer pursuing Langston through the island's maze of rocks and caves. She moved toward the sound, her heart pounding, but her resolve unshaken. The trail ended at a cliff overlooking the sea where Langston stood, the valise clutched to his chest. His accomplice was nowhere in sight, likely caught by Craddock. Langston's eyes darted wildly, searching for an escape. Below, a small boat bobbed in the waves, its engine idling her. Getaway plan, no doubt. Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice calm. "It's over, Mr. Langston. There's nowhere left to run." Langston spun, his pistol raised, but his hand shook. "You," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "The old woman from the village. You think you can stop me. I don't need to stop you," Miss Marple said, her eyes steady. "You've stopped yourself. Men like you always do. You thought you could charm your way out of anything, but charm doesn't hide footprints, or stolen jewels, or the truth." Langston laughed, a harsh, desperate sound. "You're a fool, old woman. You have no proof." "Oh, but I do," Miss Marple said. "The sapphire brooch, the note by the oak tree, your trips to London, and now this cave filled with your spoils. The police are here, Mr. Langston, and they've seen everything." Langston's face paled, but before he could respond, Craddock emerged from the fog, his weapon drawn. The officer followed, dragging the accomplice in handcuffs. Langston's shoulders slumped, the fight draining from him. He dropped the pistol, and Craddock moved swiftly, securing his wrists. Miss Marple stepped back, her heart